If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 81, I want to live under the same sun as you. Dragonite Valley. The valley plain was not just a flat grassland, the surrounding hills were dotted with caves of various sizes. These were places the Dragonite used for shelter during rain or snow. Most of the time they were unnecessary, they would usually just sleep on the soft plains. But for the Zubat, who couldn't be exposed to direct sunlight, these caves were always useful. After all, the Zubat species itself preferred to live in nests inside caves. While Will was learning skills from the Dragonite chief, the Zubat would obediently stay in these caves. A week passed in a flash. Will had originally thought that his leveling progress would stagnate for a while after coming to Dragonite Valley, as he didn't think he could find any suitable opponents in this central region. But later, while practicing his skills, he was struck by a realization: he could spar with the other Dragonair. One sunny day, Will was learning the move Fire Spin from the Dragonite chief. He had already been learning it for a week. The chief hadn't proactively taught him this, it was a move Will had requested. When he had first arrived, the chief had required him to have a test battle with another Dragonair. He had wanted to see Will's current skill level to provide more targeted teaching. In that battle, Will had been severely hampered by the other Dragonair's Fire Spin. The move's damage wasn't high, but its ability to lock down movement was truly powerful. You either had to take the damage or have your actions restricted. So, after the battle, Will had proactively asked to learn it. This request was made with a specific purpose in mind. Will had never forgotten that his future enemies were not a single Pokémon, but a group of Pokémon and humans. A move like Fire Spin might not have the raw power of Flamethrower, but on a battlefield, its effect would be far superior. Just then, Dragonite. A crimson energy flashed in the Dragonite chief's mouth. The next moment, a surging vortex of fire shot towards Will. Of course, the chief didn't intend to one-shot him. He didn't have the attack hit directly, but instead used the massive vortex to surround him. This served several purposes. It allowed Will to personally experience how Fire Spin was used and how it worked, and it also let him figure out how to escape when trapped by it. And the chief's Fire Spin was completely different from the one used by the other Dragonair. At least in Will's eyes, the difference in proficiency had turned it into a completely different skill. The other Dragonair's was the Fire Spin most people imagined. But the chief's was a whole new move. Perhaps it could be called a fire cage. Because at that moment, you couldn't even see Will on the plain, only an oval-shaped, constantly spinning cage of fire. Will was inside it. In a nearby cave. Zubat bat. The Zubat felt the wave of heat wash over it and became extremely anxious. It flapped its wings, flying in circles inside the damp, dark cave. It tried to step outside, but the scorching sunlight hit its wings, and a burning pain immediately made it shrink back. It had always been a rather timid child. Inside the fire cage on the plain. There's not a single crack, Will said, looking at the seamless wall of fire. He truly felt the power of the Dragonite chief. A normal Fire Spin was made of strands of fire with gaps in between. A slightly stronger, more proficient one might form a wall, but it wouldn't seal the top. But this one didn't even leave a window. He didn't dare to just ram his way out. The damage from Fire Spin wasn't high, but it depended on who was using it. The chief was at least 20 levels higher than him. He couldn't even imagine how powerful this Fire Spin was. If he were even grazed by it, he'd probably faint. I can only try a water-type move. Will could feel the surrounding temperature getting higher and higher, sweat was already starting to form on his skin. He couldn't let this continue. Brine. First, he whipped his tail, sending countless streams of cold water at the surrounding flames. But unfortunately, the moment the water touched the fire, it was instantly vaporized into steam. The only effect this move had was to briefly lower the temperature inside the vortex. It was useless. He had to try something else. Water pulse. Will shot a large water pulse orb towards one spot on the wall. He then followed closely behind it, preparing to break out. If it was strong enough, the water pulse could open a hole in the fire wall, and he could escape unharmed. If it wasn't, it could at least temporarily slow the wall's temperature and rotation, weakening it and giving him a chance to break through. If even water pulse couldn't help him escape, then he didn't know what to do. I'm betting it all on this one. Water pulse, I believe in you. Will gritted his teeth and followed closely behind his attack. The next moment, pop! The water pulse was like a balloon hitting a needle. It burst violently, having almost no effect on the wall of fire. Water pulse, I'll never believe in you again. That was Will's last thought before he fainted. The Dragonite chief on the plain saw a blackened serpent get flung out of the vortex. He was a little confused at first, but then he immediately realized it was Will. He wasn't too alarmed and had a Dragonair, who was already waiting, feed Will a few berries. They were berries that looked like green strawberries, known as pecha berries, specifically used for treating burns. Zubat. Just as the Dragonite chief was pondering his next lesson, a piercing cry came from the distance. He turned his head and his eyes widened. He saw the Zubat flying out of the cave. Night. The chief remembered it was the little one Will had brought with him and was startled. Others might not know, but having lived for so long, how could he not? The reason Zubat were nocturnal wasn't because they didn't want to come out in the day. It was because their body structure made it impossible for them to do so. But the next moment, all eyes were on that Zubat. A minute ago, the Zubat, which was constantly sensing Will's presence, felt his aura weaken and not stop weakening. It could no longer hold back and rushed out. It had no eyes, it couldn't see anything. It didn't know what kind of environment it was in, nor what was causing its body so much pain. Zubat. The pained cry in its throat could not drown out its call for Will. The wings that were in so much pain it could barely feel them could not stop its determination to fly to him. The worry for Will. The desire to see Will. The desire to be closer to Will. In this moment, these feelings intertwined, converged, and fused. I want to live under the same sun as you. I don't want to keep watching you from the dark, distant shadows as you slowly fly away. As long as I can reach your side, I don't care if I become a monster. The desire for change reached its peak. The energy inside the Zubat's body surged unstoppably. This surge was not permanent, but it was enough to push the Zubat to the threshold it was already so close to. A light more dazzling than the sun suddenly burst forth from its body. Even the brilliant sun had to temporarily yield to the light of evolution. The form within the white light gradually changed. The flames ignited by the sun faded from its body. The next moment, the Zubat, in a brand new form, flew towards Will. Golbat Bat. The newly evolved Golbat no longer feared the sun. It no longer needed ultrasonic waves to perceive the world. In this moment, it could see all the vibrant colors of the world. But its gaze, naturally, fell first upon the one it had longed for, Will. Just as when it was born, the first living being it had sensed with its ultrasonic waves was him. Night, the Dragonite chief sighed in relief. That scene had really scared him. But thinking back on it now, he couldn't help but be moved by the bond between Will and the Golbat. He had thought that after living for 1,000 years, his heart had turned to stone. But now, it was still so easily touched by the feelings between other Pokémon. This really didn't fit the image of a domineering, cold-hearted leader. Dragonite. The chief clenched his fist. He decided to continue to work hard to cultivate a strong heart. Starting tomorrow, he would try to maintain a stern face for a whole day. Will woke up the next day. He glanced at the Golbat guarding his left side and the shiny Dragonite on his right, and decided to go back to sleep for a while. Half an hour later, he woke up again and accepted the Golbat's new form. Although the Golbat was stronger and no longer feared the sun, its appearance was really no better than the Zubat's. It was on the same level as the chubby shiny Dragonite. Golbat, congratulations! You can see the world now, Will said, but he still had to congratulate him on his evolution. However, he felt that something was not quite right. According to his predictions, the Zubat shouldn't have reached the level to evolve yet. Could he have been mistaken? Golbat Bat, the Golbat affectionately snuggled up and hugged Will. With its 3-meter size and nearly 6-meter wingspan, it easily enveloped Will's entire head in its embrace. Its large mouth, which couldn't fully close, was over 2 meters long. As it hugged Will, it looked like it was about to stuff his head in its mouth. Oh well, Will thought, looking at the healthy and happy Golbat, and decided not to think about it anymore. Although in theory, a Zubat should evolve at LV22, that was just a theory. Evolving 1 or 2 levels early probably wasn't that strange. Chapter 82, With You and I Together, We're Invincible, Part 3. Time flew by. In the blink of an eye, Will and Golbat had been in Dragonite Valley for 2 months. The world had passed from autumn back into winter. Will had originally thought he could return to his cave before winter, but the joy and progress of learning new skills had made him stay a little longer. In these 2 months, Will had devoted himself wholeheartedly to his training, successively mastering 4 new moves: Fire Spin, Surf, Dragon Dance, and Dragon Pulse. He didn't have to think much about his choice of skills. Apart from Fire Spin at the beginning, which he chose after witnessing its power and versatility, he prioritized water and dragon-type moves purely because he possessed the Mystic Water and the Dragon Fang. It was a matter of cost-effectiveness. The excellent setup move Dragon Dance was also a must-have. While such buffing moves aren't always impressive in the anime, they hold a very high status in the competitive scene of the games, and their practical effects in reality would only be more pronounced. Although Dragon Dance is a move a Dragonair can learn naturally by reaching LV 60, what's wrong with mastering it early? Who knew how long it would take to reach LV 60? By the small lake in Dragonite Valley, Will glanced at Golbat playing with 2 other Dragonair in the distance, then looked down at his own reflection in the water and mumbled, "It's about time I left." Ying! A surprised cry came from beside him. "You again," Will said, turning his head to find that a Dragonair had somehow snuck up behind him. It looked like she had been planning to startle him but had stopped after hearing his words. This was the same graceful female Dragonair who had immediately taken a liking to him when he first arrived. Although Will was face-blind, from the looks he got from the other female Dragonite, Dragonair, and Dragonite, he could guess that he was quite the handsome one. And this one had fallen for him at first sight. No, that's not right. It was lust at first sight. In any case, for the past 2 months, this Dragonair had often stuck by his side to play with him. Although their activities just looked like ordinary children playing, the mentality of most Pokémon was like that of human children, and playing together was one way they expressed affection. Furthermore, she often performed a certain action, just like now. Will flicked his tail, knocking away the female's tail that was trying to intertwine with his. Times had changed. After living with the Dragonite clan, he now knew that intertwining tails was a Dragonair's way of courting. The thought of how many people and Pokémon he had wrapped his own tail around in the past gave him a headache. Thank goodness they didn't know what it meant, or the social embarrassment would have been fatal. Ying! The female Dragonair slumped down, dejected. She didn't understand. In the past 2 months, she must have tried to court him at least 100 times, if not 800. Why wouldn't he submit to her? Could this iron-hearted male dragon not feel her passionate heart? If she failed this time, would she ever have a chance to see him again? As long as we're alive, we'll see each other again. I'm leaving. Ying! Goodbye. Will bid farewell to the Dragonair, called over Golbat, and went to find the Dragonite chief. He had learned 4 new skills and gained a level in the valley, it would be rude to leave without saying thanks. The Dragonite chief was very understanding about his departure. He had never forgotten that Will had said he would return to that human's side. He only instructed Will to be careful in the future and then led the other clan members to see him off. The shiny Dragonite was the one to escort him back. It was very reluctant to see him go, even crying for him at the thought of the hard life he was returning to. As they neared the cave, the shiny Dragonite gave Will a hug and then left, saying he should come back to visit if he had the chance. But Will guessed that he probably wouldn't be staying on MT Silver for much longer. He was now LV 48, not far from the LV 55 required for evolution. In as little as half a year, or a year at most, he would evolve into a Dragonite and return to the Dragonite Kingdom. Back at the cave, Will and Golbat didn't see the Scyther crew, they must have gone out to train. He didn't wait around and took Golbat out to level up. With his current level and deep move pool, he could start challenging the alphas of the middle ring. And by a strange coincidence, the first alpha he set his sights on was a Beedrill alpha, not far from his cave. When he and Golbat arrived near the Beedrill's territory, he found that his Scyther friends were already there, and they were in the middle of a battle with the Beedrill. "This is a losing fight," Will said, shaking his head after a glance. The top-end power of this Beedrill clan wasn't very strong, but their strength was in their vast numbers, making the clan as a whole quite formidable. The alpha was probably only LV 45, one of the weakest in the middle ring. But they had a dozen other Beedrill between LV 40 and 45, which was terrifying. On the Scyther's side, there were 7 of them. Besides the 6 old Scyther he knew, there was also a younger-looking one, probably only in its 30s level-wise. The current situation was that one high-level Beedrill was fighting one old Scyther, while the other 6 high-level Beedrill, including the alpha, were ganging up on his friend. Surrounding them was a circle of 50 or so Beedrill in their 20s and 30s, watching menacingly. Will was quite impressed by his old friend. His level had actually reached 48, the same as his own. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to hold off 6 Beedrill at once. For a Scyther of his age to raise his level so quickly, he must have been training incredibly hard these past few months. Thunderbolt. Against a swarm of flying-type Pokémon, there was no better move than this. No wonder Ash's Pikachu spammed Thunderbolt all the time. One shock could hit a whole group, racking up tons of EXP. It was a guaranteed good time. Scyther. Hey, long time no see. Let's deal with these guys first. Remember? With you and I together. Scyther, we're invincible, ... The old alpha smiled and nodded, wasting no more words. With their current rapport, everything was understood. Bzzz. XN. Seeing a new enemy join the fight, the other Beedrill stopped watching and charged forward all at once. What the hell? Are these Beedrill insane? They have no martial ethics. Fly higher. Will was startled to see 50 or 60 Beedrill rushing at them. He quickly shielded Golbat and whipped his long tail high into the air. Surf. A 7-meter high wave erupted from beneath him, and under his control, it crashed outwards in all directions. It was an indiscriminate, undirected area of effect attack. If the Scyther hadn't flown high in advance at his warning, they would have been hit by it too. Bzzz. Many of the lower-level Beedrill were one-shot by the move. A large-scale AoE attack like this was exactly what the Scyther crew lacked. If his friend had such a move, with his level, he wouldn't have had to fear these Beedrill either. Use astonished to join the fight, Will said to Golbat behind him. With so much experience on the table, he might as well let Golbat get a piece of the action. Golbat nodded, and an invisible shriek began to pour from its mouth. In reality, a sound wave move like this was also quite formidable. It was fast, had a wide range, and was colorless and formless, making it hard to dodge. It wouldn't do much damage to the Beedrill, but it counted as participating in the battle. By the time the battle was over and the Beedrill were scattered on the ground with swirly eyes, Golbat's level had jumped 3 times, to LV23. If it had been able to contribute more to the fight, its share of the experience would have been even greater. But Will was very satisfied with this. There would be plenty of opportunities to let Golbat leech experience in the future. Scyther, the old alpha said after the battle, welcoming Will's return. What's with these Beedrill? Do the ones in the middle ring have no sense of honor? Will asked after a casual greeting. Ever since he had come to the middle ring, he had found that most Pokémon species fought with honor. Except for a few whose racial instinct was to swarm and gang up, most would seek out an evenly matched opponent for a 1v1 duel between true warriors. For example, when the Kangaskhan and Dragonite clans fought, although it might look like a chaotic melee, each Pokémon had actually found an opponent of equal strength to fight one-on-one. Scyther, the old alpha shook its head, indicating it didn't really know either. As far as it remembered, starting about 20 years ago, the Beedrill swarms in MT Silver had all changed their fighting style. Compared to the less efficient 1v1s of the past, they were now much more proficient at ganging up on others, especially lone Pokémon that wandered into their territory. 20 years ago. Will remembered that was the time of his first life. A cold sweat trickled down his forehead. He turned to the younger-looking Scyther and asked, "What's the deal with this one?" Scyther, the old alpha explained. They had been out looking for opponents when they found this Scyther, which had mistakenly wandered into the Beedrill's territory, so they had decided to rescue it. Scyther, the younger one said, thanking Will and the others before turning to leave. It seemed to intend to continue on its own, which baffled the old veterans, who thought the youth of today were truly audacious. Chapter 83, The Final Battle. Another autumn. Will didn't know how much longer it was until winter's arrival. He only knew that it had been 2.5 years since he had come to this world. He still hadn't learned to sing, dance, or rap. After all, he had spent 1.5 years of that time fighting non-stop in this mountain range. It's been a long time since I've been back to the Dragonite Kingdom, but I should be heading back in the next couple of days, Will thought, turning his head to look outside the cave. The forest seemed untouched by the ravages of time, it looked exactly the same as it had last autumn. He glanced at his personal status screen and couldn't help but grin. Level, 54. Height, 12m. Weight, 80 kilograms. Moves, Rain Dance, Scale Shot. The growth in his height and weight was nothing to him. The increase in his level was what made him happiest. Last winter, when he had just left Dragonite Valley, he was only LV 48. Now, he had gained 6 levels in 3 seasons, a speed that met his expectations. Moreover, he had been at LV 54 for some time now. The gradually rising temperature and abundant energy within his body were a constant reminder, he was about to evolve. As for the 2 new moves, Rain Dance and Scale Shot, the former was a weather move he had learned naturally as he leveled up, which he had not yet used. Most Pokémon would not casually use weather-altering moves outside of battle, their very genes warned them that doing so would impact nature. The latter was a low-damage, multi-hit Dragon-type move that increased speed at the cost of lowering defense. It wasn't strong, but it wasn't weak either. In any case, he didn't particularly like using it. "Alright, it's about time to go deal with that one," Will said, heading out of the cave. There were many powerful alphas in the middle ring, the kind that could hold their own even in the central region. But most of them understood the principle of better to be the head of a chicken than the tail of a phoenix. Even though the central region had more abundant resources and fewer creatures, if you couldn't secure food and territory, it was all meaningless. So, for the high-level Pokémon who were already satisfied with their resources and had no higher ambitions, staying in the middle ring was the best choice. Most of these alphas had already been defeated by Will. There was only one left, one that lived year-round in a lake. Because he hadn't fought underwater in a long time, Will had saved this one for last. There was a clear boundary between the central and middle rings. At a certain altitude, the terrain of MT Silver changed abruptly. The result was a sheer cliff face, nearly 5 meters high. This cliff became the dividing line. Climb up, and you were in the central region. Jump down, and you were in the middle ring. Directly below this cliff face was a huge lake. It was the water source for the Pokémon in that area, and also the territory of a certain Pokémon. Will was now approaching that lake. He stopped in the canopy of a tree and looked around. If it wasn't near the lake, it had to be in the lake. Will quietly slipped into the water. The next moment, he was so scared his heart nearly leaped out of his chest. The moment he entered the water, a meter-long face was right in front of him, its 2 creepy, sinister eyes staring straight at him. This was the alpha of the lake. A Feraligatr. Feraligatr is the final stage of the Johto region's water-type starter. Its stats are relatively balanced, making it a fairly tanky physical fighter. However, compared to the other water-type starters, Feraligatr ranks at the bottom in terms of strength, design, and popularity. It's not that Feraligatr is a bad Pokémon, but its contemporaries are just too strong. First place is the undisputed king, Swampert, a T0 tier powerhouse even among all water types. Then you have Empoleon, Blastoise, Greninja, and Primarina, each of which is exceptional in at least 1 or 2 categories. Even the later generation INTE Leon is stronger than Feraligatr. Only Samurott and the recently debuted Quaquaval are currently ranked below it. Another thing that affected Feraligatr's popularity was that although Ash's Totodile was lively and cute, it was completely overshadowed by the true god of its generation, Chikorita. Chikorita's love and possessiveness towards Ash was so endearing that its popularity at the time even surpassed Pikachu's, scaring the officials into quickly evolving it to make it less cute and lower its popularity, lest it obstruct Pikachu's own path to godhood. What is this guy doing? Will was startled by the Feraligatr, then warily met its gaze. This Feraligatr was a full 5 meters tall, which was quite exaggerated. To become an alpha, you not only needed to occupy a large enough territory, but also be the leader of a clan. But this Feraligatr had no clan, it had always fought alone. Without the alpha bonus, to still reach a height of 5 meters was a testament to its strength. But against Will, it still wasn't enough. Its water-type moves would be halved against the dragon-type Will, while Will had 3 super effective electric-type moves, Thunder Wave, Thunderbolt, and Thunder. Gatr. The Feraligatr, seeing Will, lifted its eyelids and shuddered. It had been in a daze, and when it came to, it was startled to find a giant serpent in its territory. Realizing this, it felt it had lost face and became angry. It spat into the water and then charged at Will. Although a Feraligatr's body is huge and doesn't look very agile, when it pounces on its prey, its speed is blindingly fast. In the water, it's even faster. This is the last battle, I suppose, Will thought, unhurriedly using Thunder Wave as the Feraligatr swam towards him. In the water, the move's accuracy was almost 100%. However, the diffused effect wasn't as strong as a direct hit, so for the Feraligatr, it was just a slight numbness. But Will wasn't trying to paralyze it. He was just taunting it, making sure it would follow him. The next moment, Will turned and swam towards the shore. The Feraligatr's level was a high 55, higher than his own. He certainly wasn't going to give it the home field advantage. Although a Dragonair is also good at fighting in the water is ultimately a water type's domain. Rua. The Feraligatr was a simple-minded brute. It didn't consider things like home field advantage. It leaped directly out of the water and lunged at Will, its mouth gaping. A mouth over a meter high could bite Will's body in two with just a couple of chomps. Crunch! As expected, an ordinary Pokémon wouldn't know about type matchups, Will thought, observing the light on the Feraligatr's teeth. A dim, brownish energy indicated the move was either bite or crunch. Crunch was stronger and had a chance to lower the target's defense. But a Feraligatr could learn Ice Fang at LV21, its only move that was super effective against him. While Crunch was stronger in a vacuum, Ice Fang would deal significantly more damage to Will. But the Feraligatr clearly didn't know this. This was a huge advantage for Will. Not a type advantage, but an intellectual one. Against such a dim-witted opponent, the battle should be easy, even with the level difference. Will didn't even need to use agility. He just lifted his body to create distance and easily dodged. Then, from the air, he unleashed his skills on the Feraligatr below. Twister. Fire Spin. A purple tornado and a vortex of fire shot towards the Feraligatr one after another. It was a complete brute. It didn't dodge, but instead used Whirlpool, spitting a vortex of water from its mouth to block both of Will's attacks. But this played right into his hands. He had intended to trap the Feraligatr to give himself time and space to set up. Now, the Feraligatr had controlled itself. Dragon Dance X3. Focus Energy. Will had originally planned to use Dragon Dance and Focus Energy just once, assuming the Feraligatr would have attacked again by then. But who would have thought it would get into a stubborn contest with his Twister and Fire Spin, refusing to stop using Whirlpool until they were gone. So, Will took the opportunity to use Dragon Dance 2 more times. The main purpose was to increase his speed, allowing him to attack so fast that the Feraligatr wouldn't be able to react. The attack bonus was less useful, as both Thunder and Thunderbolt were special attacks. Agility. Buff stacked, time to strike. The Feraligatr, looking at the clear sky above, nodded with satisfaction. But after a second, it scratched its head. Something's missing from my field of vision, what was it? Feraligatr. The next moment, it felt itself being constricted by a long, blue rope, the immense force nearly making it vomit up its lunch. Then, the blue rope released a powerful electric current. A moment later, the Feraligatr smelled something burning. Just in case, and not to waste the Dragon Dance bonus, Will then used Slam to smash the Feraligatr heavily onto the ground, then followed up with another Thunderbolt for good measure. Under this unexplained combo, the Feraligatr finally lost consciousness. Chapter 84, A Pseudo-Legendary at last. After the battle ended, the pure white light of evolution enveloped Will's body, just as he had expected. The figure within the light began to change. While most Pokémon evolutions involve getting taller, in Will's case, he was getting shorter. He was, however, getting much wider. In a few moments, the beautiful, elegant, and noble Dragonair was gone. In its place stood a giant, chubby, orange baby. Dragonite the evolved Will roared excitedly, stomping on the spot. He looked down at himself, and then froze. So big. So round. Will looked down, bewildered, and poked his new belly with a finger. Boing! It even had a sound effect. Will. He looked closely and found he couldn't even see his own fingers anymore. Oh my god, what happened to my figure? Will's face went pale. He quickly opened his personal status screen. 900 kilograms. His face turned white, and his eyes rolled back, he almost fainted. This wasn't a dragon. This was clearly a pig. But then his gaze shifted upwards, and seeing his new height, he found it wasn't so hard to accept. He was a bit fat, yes, but he was also tall. Aside from the Alpha Dragonite, you couldn't find a second one this tall in the entire Dragonite Valley. If he were to get the Alpha designation, he might even surpass the chief. And were there even higher designations above Alpha? The Alpha Dragonite was one thing, but what kind of designation did that underground ruler, the Tyranitar, have? Will remembered the chief saying that even he had to look up to that Tyranitar. But he also clearly remembered that the Tyranitar had no clan, which meant it couldn't get the alpha designation. So where did its massive size come from? Will had no idea. Pushing those thoughts aside, Will began to estimate his height to weight ratio. The Pokédex values for a Dragonite are 2.2 meters and 210 kilograms. He was 6.6 meters and 900 kilograms. Wah, I'm a fat dragon, Will wailed, on the verge of tears. You didn't even need to do the math, it was obvious at a glance. He tried to cry, but no tears came out, instead, a stream of snot ran from his nose. Will casually picked up a passing ferret, held it to his nose, blew forcefully, and then tossed it aside to continue observing his status screen. Hey! The bewildered ferret looked at the sticky liquid on its tail, then looked at Will in anger. But when it realized that even standing up, it wasn't as tall as this fatty's leg, it turned and ran away, dejected. My potential turned to gold, wait a minute. Will noticed the change in his potential, and then suddenly frowned. He thought back to his potential as a Weedle, Kakuna, and Beedrill in his past life, and then to his potential as a Dragonite, Dragonair, and now Dragonite in this life. He had a sudden realization. This potential, isn't it just base stat total? Will's eyes widened. The levels were divided by every 100 points of BST, white, green, blue, purple, an unknown tier, and gold. A Dragonite 600 BST had just entered the gold tier. However, this wasn't something he paid special attention to. He didn't believe a Pokémon was bound by its potential. BST only determines a Pokémon's floor, its ceiling is determined by itself and its trainer. His gaze moved down. He couldn't help but smile at his new dragon/flying typing. It wasn't the best combination, but it was pretty good. Immune to ground. 2x resistance to fighting, bug, fire, and water, and 4x resistance to grass. It's worth noting that in the future era of leagues, fighting, water, and fire would be popular types. But in this era of primal beasts, none of them were popular. Instead, bug-type Pokémon were everywhere, as they were easier for humans to approach, capture, and raise. As for its weaknesses, it was 2x weak to rock, dragon, and fairy, and 4x weak to ice. The old saying still held true, a 4x weakness to ice is the mark of a true powerhouse. And in this era, ice-type Pokémon were even rarer than in the future. A Pokémon like Dragonite was destined to shine brightly in this era of primal beasts, forging its name as a pseudo-legendary. Next was his ability, Inner Focus, which was unremarkable in the games. There, it just prevented flinching and being intimidated. Its practical effect in reality was hard to say, but it probably just meant a strong mind. In any case, it had to be better than its simple game effect. Then he got to the part that confused him. Rap, Leer, Twister, and Thunder Wave had all vanished from his skill list. That's bullshit, I haven't forgotten them, Will said, getting anxious. He walked over to a tree to test it. Leer was unimportant, but the other three were very useful. Rap was for making Thunder 100% accurate. Twister was versatile. And Thunder Wave was a reliable paralysis move. He wasn't about to just lose them. Bzzzt. He raised a hand, and an invisible current of electricity shot towards the tree trunk. See? I still remember it, he frowned and looked at his status screen again. His eyes widened. The screen had changed, and Thunder Wave had reappeared in his skill list. I see, now he understood. Some Pokémon forget certain moves upon evolution, while at the same time, they awaken other moves from the depths of their memory. In the games, you had to use the move relearner. But Will was different. He had a human soul and a powerful memory system. He could instantly recall and remaster these 4 forgotten skills. He tested the other 3, and sure enough, all 4 were back in his skill list. I should be able to learn some new skills too, Will murmured. He recalled that he should be able to learn Thunder Punch, Fire Punch, and Extreme Speed just by remembering them. I'll figure it out when I get back to the Dragonite Kingdom. If not, I can go back to Dragonite Valley to learn. At my current speed, it shouldn't even take an hour to fly there, Will said, looking at the 2 small wings on his back. Then he looked down and patted his doin belly. Can I even fly with this thing? A doubt crept into his mind. He tried to flap his small wings, and the next moment, he was in the air. Thanks to his past life experience flying as a Beedrill, he quickly got the hang of it. He didn't feel his flight was affected by his weight at all. Night Will flew around excitedly, waving his new arms and legs. He didn't know how he had survived the last 2.5 years without them. And finally, his eyes fell on the last move on his list, Hurricane. As a flying type, it was a bit funny that this was his only flying type move. But this was a big one, with a power of 110 and a chance to confuse the opponent. Although a Dragonite's stats leaned towards being a physical fighter, Will's own personality leaned towards being a mage. He felt it was a waste of his flying ability not to attack from a distance. He had won countless battles in MT Silver this way. Those melee-only Pokémon were just sitting ducks against him. Nightwill flapped his wings in the air and sent a ferocious storm towards the forest. Wherever the hurricane passed, it was like a bulldozer had plowed through, ripping leaves from the trees and sending countless innocent Pokémon and small animals flying. The invisible gales even tore bark from the tree trunks. Both its power and its range were absurd. Strong. Chapter 85, Let's battle together again someday. In the evening, outside the cave. Dragonite. Will, having returned from testing out his newfound strength, let out a wolf-like howl. From inside the cave, the Scyther crew heard the strange cry and swarmed out, ready to see which suicidal fool was making such a racket at their doorstep. Then they saw the chubby Dragonite, Will in his brand new form. Scyther. While the other Scyther were still baffled, Will's friend immediately guessed the identity of the big, fat dragon. That's right. I evolved. Will said, proudly patting his belly. He spread his arms and walked over, preparing to give his friend a big hug. He finally had arms again, and he was going to use them to their fullest. Duan. His belly arrived before his hands. As he went to embrace the Scyther, his stomach made contact first and sent his friend bouncing away. This move was called the meatball bounce. The repelled Scyther looked at Will's trembling belly, a question mark floating above its head. Is it really that springy? Never mind that. Scyther, I'm super strong now, Will said. Scyther, the old alpha nodded, indicating it could see that. Although Will's current form was a bit comical, the power within his new body was undeniable. Compared to before, it was a qualitative leap. Just yesterday, he felt their strengths weren't that far apart. But today, he felt that all 6 of the other Scyther combined probably wouldn't be a match for Will. Of course, that might be because the other 5 were just too weak. Where's Golbat? Get him out here. I'm going to give him a big hug, Will said, waving his arms. Scyther, the old alpha gave Will a strange look, then turned and went into the cave to get Golbat. The reason he found it strange was that Will seemed to have become a bit of a goofball. The Dragonair version of Will had always given him the impression of being steady, noble, elegant, and aloof. But today, the Dragonite version of Will had a completely different feel. To put it bluntly, he was a bit of a clown. Could evolution really change a person that much? How terrifying! The Scyther shook its head and called out the Golbat. The Golbat had now reached LV 35. This wasn't particularly high in the middle ring, but it was enough to get by without having to hide in the cave all the time. Besides, with the LV 52 Scyther guarding it, there wouldn't be any problems. Golbat just preferred to stay in cool, dark places. Probably because it had spent its time as a Zubat in the cave, the place still gave it a great sense of security even after evolving. Golbat, the Golbat came out and recognized Will at a glance. It didn't even have to guess, the moment it saw him, it knew this strange-looking fellow was actually Will. Golbat Will rushed over, pulled the Golbat into an embrace, and nuzzled its cheek against it. Having arms was the best feeling. You could hug whoever you wanted. Bat. Being hugged by Will, the Golbat seemed to be paralyzed. Its entire body visibly softened, and it finally just went limp on Will's large stomach. As professionally certified by Dragon Master Iris, a Dragonite's body is soft and squishy. For any trainer who likes Dragon-type Pokémon, Dragonite is a must-have. Among the many Dragon types, Dragonite might not be at the very top tier of strength without a Mega Evolution, but it is the most suitable Dragon companion for a trainer. Its body is so soft it can be compared to an Altaria's cotton wings, and hugging one is the ultimate enjoyment for any trainer who loves to be close with their Pokémon. Moreover, most Dragonite are gentle and kind, and they are meticulous and caring, no less so than a Chansey or an Audino. Whether as a companion for the elderly or for children, the Dragonite line are excellent caretakers. At this moment, Golbat was completely lost in Will's embrace. By the way, Scyther, it's time for me to leave MT Silver, Will said, putting Golbat down and looking at his friend. In his 1.5 years on this mountain, he hadn't made many friends. Scyther was the one he was closest to, they held a special meaning for each other. Scyther was the first true friend Will had made in this world. And Will was the one who had saved Scyther's life at its lowest point and helped it reclaim its honor. The two of them had defeated countless enemies together. To say they were invincible was an exaggeration, but they had yet to taste defeat. Their relationship could be called a friendship, but it was much deeper than that of ordinary friends. Scyther, the old alpha nodded. There was no need for sorrow or sentimentality. In its 50-plus years, it had seen countless companions die. It no longer felt the same grief as it had in its youth. Besides, Will wasn't dying. He was just going back to the place he had always missed, to see the person he had always wanted to see. Scyther, the old alpha said, genuinely happy for him. Yeah, I've finally made it through, Will said, looking down at Golbat, then up at his friend. I'm taking this little guy with me. Scyther, the old alpha spread its scythes. He meant that even if Will didn't say so, the Golbat would have definitely followed him anyway. Do you want to come with me? You can bring your clansmen. You'll be treated well in the Dragonite Kingdom, Will asked. If they went to the Dragonite Kingdom, they would no longer have to worry about survival. The only thing they might have to face was the war with the Kingdom of the Land. But who knew when that war would come? It might not be for another 10 years. With their squad's combat power and coordination, they wouldn't face much trouble on the battlefield. The Scyther was silent. It turned its head and looked towards the peak of MT Silver, and finally, shook its head. I understand, Will nodded, respecting its choice. Every person has their own aspirations, and Pokémon also have their own pursuits. Just like Dawn's Bizel, who loved to battle. Jessie's Dustux, who found true love. Ash's Squirtle, who loved firefighting, his Butterfree, who fell in love at first sight, his Primeape, who longed to be a fighting champion, his Apome, who loved to perform, his Goodra, who couldn't bear to leave its homeland, and his Greninja, who decided to protect Kalos. They were all lucky to have met trainers who respected them. In the end, their trainers never forced them to follow their own path, but chose to let them pursue their own lives. Scyther, the old alpha said, indicating it would see him off. All right, Will didn't refuse. He woke up Golbat and then slowly flew down the mountain. Scyther. Yeah, I'll definitely be back. I'll probably need to come to Dragonite Valley to learn some skills from the chief occasionally. I'll drop by and see you then. Will nodded. He felt that he would be able to see his friend again soon. With a Grandmaster of his own species like the Dragonite chief around, there was really no need to learn skills from other Pokémon. Once he mastered extreme speed, it might not even take him half an hour to get from the palace to Dragonite Valley. One more thing. A great war might break out in the human world in the next 2 years. I don't know if it will affect MT Silver, but you need to be careful. If the flames of war spread here, take your clan and seek refuge in the Dragonite capital, or fly to Dragonite Valley for protection. Scyther, the old alpha nodded, taking note. It had always felt that although Will was young, he was exceptionally smart and knew many things. So, it had always believed deeply in his words. By the way, come with me somewhere, Will said, about to fly out of MT Silver when he saw a small lake below. Memories came flooding back. Scyther. Just come with me. Will flew down and stopped beside the lake. This place was truly nostalgic for him. In his first life as a Weedle, he had been born here. That whole life had been spent fighting for territory around this lake. It was also near here that he had met the 8-year-old Liz. He still remembered bringing her here for a bath. In his second life as a Dragonite, he had been born in this very lake. Shortly after being reborn, he had tried to go ashore to check the situation, only to be immediately picked up and carried away by the 28-year-old Liz. Thinking back on it now, it was an incredible coincidence, as if an invisible thread had connected him and Liz across 20 years. And later, he had brought Iris here and caught 2 Magikarp, who were now Carp and Little Splasher. Scyther. This is where Liz and I first met, Will said casually, then leaped into the water. He couldn't explain the full extent of his connection to this lake to his friend. Underwater. Phew. Will lay quietly at the bottom. The surrounding water-type Pokémon and fish had all been scared away by this behemoth and were now trembling in the corners of the lake. In a daze, ripples spread across the surface of the lake above. He seemed to see a blurry image. He couldn't see it clearly, but he recognized one of the figures. It was Liz. He thought he saw Liz come to the lake alone, sit down under a nearby tree, and look at him in the water. In that moment, it seemed Liz saw him too. Lan! She called out softly, reaching a hand towards him in the water. Liz! Will's eyes suddenly widened. He shot up from the bottom of the lake. The moment his head broke the surface, there was no Liz, only the Scyther, waiting quietly by the shore. Scyther! It's nothing. I should be going. You should head back too, Scyther. Scyther! Let's battle together again someday. Chapter 86, Lan, my Lan. Dragonite capital, the royal study. Another winter is coming. Liz stopped writing, stood up, and walked to the window to look outside. Every day, she would stand by the window and gaze at the sky. Because any day now, a little blue serpent might come flying from the horizon, and she didn't want it to arrive and not see her there. It's been almost 8 seasons since Lan left. Liz raised a hand to rub the corner of her eye, feeling that her vision had gotten a little worse. She was turning 30 this year. At 30, a common woman would have long been married, a wife for who knows how many years. Only she remained single. But Liz herself didn't care. There was no man who could catch her eye, and she didn't want to be tied down by family and children in the future. She wanted to travel the world with Lan and the others, to spread the idea that humans and Pokémon could coexist peacefully. Yes, Pokémon. That was the new name she had given to the primal beasts. Initially, she had convened her ministers to discuss a new name, but the names they proposed were full of prejudice, leaving her very dissatisfied. In the end, she decided to name them herself. And so, she came up with Pokémon. Iris, who had been there at the time, also chimed in with the name Pocket Monsters, which was also quite fitting. In any case, Liz disliked people calling Lan, Blaze, and the others beasts, so she had ordered the name change. Whether people called them Pokémon or Pocket Monsters, as long as it wasn't beasts, it was fine. Perhaps people wouldn't be able to change their habits overnight, but Liz believed that one day, the term Pokémon would spread throughout the entire world. With this hope in her heart, Liz couldn't help but smile as she looked towards the sky in the direction of MT Silver. Dragonite. Just as she was about to turn away from the window, she suddenly heard a long cry from the distant sky. Liz's heart skipped a beat. She turned back and looked out the window again. The cry was strange, she was sure she had never heard it before. But for some reason, hearing it made her feel happy. She squinted her eyes and saw a small, orange dot in the distant sky. What is that? Liz frowned, unable to make it out. She thought it was probably some kind of bird Pokémon. She often saw them passing over the capital from her study window. Generally, as long as the birds didn't cause trouble in the city, people wouldn't bother them. Dragon. The sound reached her ears again. Even though it was so far away, Liz found the sound to be incredibly clear, soft and sweet, and very comforting to listen to. Just like Lan's voice. Lan. The thought of him made Liz's brow furrow, and then her eyes widened. She threw open the window, her hands gripping the frame. Despite wearing high heels, she stood on her tiptoes, craning her neck to look into the distance. The small orange dot grew larger and larger. Liz could now confirm that it was a good-sized orange Pokémon. And clinging to its tail seemed to be a purple Pokémon. Could Lan have evolved again? Liz murmured to herself, but she felt it was unlikely. Most Pokémon still bore some resemblance to their previous forms after evolving, but this orange Pokémon looked nothing like her precious Lan. Am I just thinking too much? Liz pulled back from the window, a little disappointed. Dragon. The sound came again, incomparably clear this time. Lan. Liz's head shot up, her large, wine-red eyes shining with a brilliant light. She didn't know how she could understand it, but she was absolutely certain that the voice was calling her. It was calling, Lazy. In that moment, Liz forgot everything else. She turned and ran out the door. Because it was difficult to run in high heels, she kicked them off to the side, gathered her dress in her hands, and ran towards the courtyard. In that moment, Liz was like a princess in a fairy tale, running towards her Prince Charming. Lady Liz. Your Majesty, there's a strange, giant Pokémon approaching. Please. Lady Liz. Where are you going? Where are your shoes? The maids, guards, and even Hestia were all stunned to see her running. How long had it been since they had seen her like this? It seemed that ever since she had grown up, they had never seen her lose her composure like this in public. The few times it had been because Lord Lan had been leading her in some mischief. Lord Lan! Hestia's eyes lit up, and her expression became firm. As Liz's childhood friend, she knew better than anyone that only two things could make her act so urgently. 1. The entire army of the Kingdom of the Land was at their gates. The other, Lord Lan had returned. And Liz's joyous, ecstatic expression could only mean it was the latter. Someone, prepare food. And, bring Lord Lan's baby bottle from when he was little. Make sure to have milk ready. Yes, ma'am. XN. For the first time in a long time, a flurry of excitement filled the palace. In the courtyard, as Liz ran barefoot across the lawn, a whirlwind of sparks and lightning in her wake, Will, who had been a dot in the sky, began to rapidly descend, gliding towards her. Liz. Seeing her again, Will's mouth broke into a grin he couldn't contain. He spread his arms and rushed towards her. But he hadn't lost his senses, he remembered how strong his new body was and slowed his speed and force. Lan. Liz, however, still trusted him 1000% and ran towards him without slowing down at all. She knew her Lan would never let her get hurt. Boing! A soft, springy sound. Will and Liz embraced. But because his body and belly were so large, Liz was almost completely enveloped in his stomach. MMPH. Pat, pat. Liz, unable to breathe, quickly reached out and patted his belly. Liz, long time no see, Will said with a laugh, loosening his embrace. Lan, you've changed so much, Liz said, breaking free. The many things she had wanted to say were all forgotten the moment she saw him. She stood there, looking him over. When her gaze fell on his large stomach, her mind went blank for a second. Her eyes briefly lost focus, as if she were trying to recall his previous slender form, and then looking at him now, her brain couldn't quite process it. Lan, why are you so fat? Liz walked up, placed a hand on his belly, gave it a little poke, and then looked up at him in disbelief. Will was speechless, his expression dumbfounded. They hadn't seen each other in so long. She wasn't going to cry with emotion, but the first thing she says is that he's fat? Will was angry. He put on a hurt expression and turned his head away, ignoring her. Even if you're chubby, you're still super cute. The cutest baby in the world. Seeing this, Liz quickly tried to comfort him. She came forward and spread her arms, trying to hug him with all her might. But with her arm span, she couldn't even wrap them halfway around his belly. Humph, I'll forgive you this time, Will grinned. How could he really be angry with her over something like this? He reached out and pulled her into his embrace, nuzzling her with his chubby cheek. Ooh, so comfortable, so soft. Being held by Will like this, Liz felt like her body was melting. When he had hugged her earlier, it had been too forceful, and she couldn't breathe, so she hadn't gotten to properly experience it. But now, being held so gently, she finally felt the immense, devastating power of a Dragonite's hug. It was so warm and comfortable, completely different from the cool feeling of a Dragonair. She couldn't even imagine how comfortable it would be to sleep in his arms on a winter night. Looks like I'll be able to get a good night's sleep every day from now on, but I'll have to get a super-sized bed, Liz thought, paralyzed in his arms, while muttering non-stop, Lan, my Lan, don't you ever leave me for so long again. I won't, Will replied with a laugh. Once he remembered extreme speed, even if he did leave, it wouldn't be for so long. Chubby baby, Lan is such a chubby baby now. Duan. Will had just returned, and Liz couldn't get enough of him, especially his big belly. She kept kneading it with both hands, kissing it again and again, leaving faint lipstick marks. Fat he may be, but in Liz's eyes, it didn't affect his cuteness at all. In fact, he was even cuter now. Stop playing. Look over here. This is Golbat. He's your partner from now on, too, Will said, pulling Liz away to reveal the Golbat behind him. Perhaps because they hadn't seen each other in so long, Liz's inner child had come out, and she was acting just like the young Liz in front of him, with none of her usual dignified and calm demeanor. Golbat. Golbat poked its head out, looking at Liz curiously. It had heard so many stories about her from Will and knew her status in his heart. But seeing a human for the first time, it thought Liz looked strange, a bit ugly, and very fragile. Hello there, Liz said, reaching out a hand to greet the Golbat. Although they hadn't seen each other in a long time, her rapport with Will hadn't diminished in the slightest. With just one action from him, she understood his meaning. And unlike Iris, Liz wasn't so focused on looks. Even though the Golbat wasn't very pretty, she treated it with great warmth and friendliness. "Liz, we're hungry," Will said, opening his mouth and pointing a finger at his throat. "Lord Lan, it's already been prepared," Hestia's voice sounded at just the right moment. Behind her was a large group of people, carrying all sorts of food to the courtyard. But everyone, including Hestia, was looking at Will with an expression of utter disbelief. After all, the change was just a little too drastic. Although he had lost his former nobility, elegance, and beauty, he had at least retained some cuteness. He was just a little fat. "Hestia, you're the best." Will gave her a thumbs up and then motioned for Golbat to dig in. As the head steward of the palace, Hestia's position was not just due to her relationship with Liz, she had a real head on her shoulders. She had long since considered the possibility that Will's appetite would increase dramatically upon his return, so she had specially ordered a huge amount of food from the kitchen, afraid he wouldn't get enough to eat. And there was also the baby bottle he had used since he was little. Although his mouth was much bigger now and the bottle was too small, if it wasn't on the table, he would still feel like something was missing. On the other side, Hestia paused for a moment, then couldn't help but let out a secret smile. Before, she often couldn't understand the meaning of his actions. Now that he had evolved and had limbs, it was much easier to understand. A moment later. So full. Golbat. Chapter 87, A Whole New Team. The news of Lord Lan's return spread throughout the capital on the very same day. Along with it, news of his adorable new appearance also made the rounds. This adorable was a direct quote from Queen Liz herself, and no one was allowed to refute it. For a time, the area outside the palace was bustling with activity. Many residents of the capital wandered near the palace, hoping to catch a glimpse of Lord Lan's new form. But while the common folk couldn't enter the palace, certain others could. For example, the little blue-haired princess of the other branch of the Dragonite clan, who had just turned 10 this year. Lan. That afternoon, Iris charged straight into the palace, shouting and searching for Will everywhere. However, she scoured the entire palace and couldn't find the familiar figure. After running around by herself for half an hour, a tired Iris finally came to the courtyard. "Sigh, where did Lan go?" Iris sat on a bench in the courtyard and turned her head to the side. On the grass next to the bench sat a chubby orange Pokémon and a large, purple, wide-mouthed Pokémon. She didn't know where these two had come from, but she wasn't surprised by their sudden appearance. After all, one or two new Pokémon suddenly appearing by Liz's side was no longer a rare sight in her eyes. Iris had come running the moment she heard Will was back, without listening to any other details, so she didn't know that the land she was familiar with now had a completely different look. "What are you running around for?" Will and Golbat were sitting on the grass, leisurely sunbathing, when Iris suddenly came running back and forth. "Ooh? Are you talking to me, big chubby guy?" Iris's eyes lit up. She jumped off the bench and ran in front of Will, looking up at him. She had wanted to approach this somewhat cute Pokémon for a while now but was worried that being too forward might make it dislike her. "So you didn't recognize me, huh?" Will sighed helplessly. That explained it. With Iris's personality, she should have immediately pounced on him the moment she knew he was back. At first, he had thought that maybe she had matured in the past 2 years. Thinking of this, Will couldn't help but look at the gardener auntie who was trimming branches in the courtyard. The auntie was smiling at them. Everyone clearly knew Iris was looking for him, but no one told her that the one sitting in the courtyard was him. They were clearly teasing the little girl. You feel familiar," Iris said, suddenly frowning and staring into Will's eyes. Gradually, her own eyes widened. She then threw herself forward, burying her entire body in Will's embrace. "You recognize me now?" Will asked with a smile. Although he didn't know how she had recognized him, he guessed it might have something to do with her dragon force. Could it have alerted her to his true identity? But that was just a guess. He wasn't a user of the dragon force, after all, and didn't know its specific effects. Lan. Iris fiercely nuzzled her cheek against his, with such force it looked like she was trying to start a fire. She hadn't recognized him because of some special power. She didn't even know she possessed such a thing. It was because no matter how much his appearance had changed, the way Will looked at her had not. so, the moment she met his gaze, she immediately knew that this big, fat dragon was Lan. In the entire world, only the Pokémon named Lan would look at her with the same kind of gaze as her own mother and father. By the way, where's your Natu? Don't you usually carry it around? Will raised a hand and patted the little girl's head, asking curiously. With how clingy she was to her Pokémon, how could they be separated? Iris had no idea what he was saying. Or rather, the little girl wasn't even listening, completely lost in her own world. Oh well. I should go check on Blaze and the others. After so long, he should have evolved into a Charmeleon by now, Will sighed, looking down at Iris, then stood up. Golbat. Golbat was dozing off but quickly stood up when Will moved. I'm taking you to meet some friends. Oh, right, this is Iris. She's your friend from now on, too. Golbat. Hello. Iris's attitude towards Golbat was rather cold. She was a complete looks chaser. A Pokémon like Golbat, which was neither cool, nor cute, nor majestic, nor elegant, really had a hard time earning her natural affection. But with Will, it was different. Because they had already built a deep emotional foundation when he was a Dragonite and a Dragonair, even though he had evolved into a shiny Dragonite, Iris would still be very close to him. Lan, where are you going? Take me with you, Iris said, hugging his big leg when she saw him stand up, afraid he would leave her behind. She hadn't gone out to play with him in a long time and was now super excited. Won't your mother spank you? Will asked with a smile, poking her. Take me, take me. All right, all right. Get on. Will scooped up the little girl, held her in his arms, and then flew into the sky with Golbat. Whoa! Flying in the sky again after so long, Iris waved her arms excitedly. Will ignored her and looked around. Having been away from the palace for 2 years, he couldn't immediately find the direction of the Pokémon Academy. That's right. The Pokémon Academy. Because the laws of the Dragonite Kingdom no longer included the term primal beast, all related institutions had been renamed. The Pokémon Academy, the Pokémon Research Institute, Pokémon Scholars, and so on. 5 seconds later, Will finally got his bearings and set off. In the sky. So fast Iris shouted from his arms. In the past, it would take Will 5 minutes to fly from the palace to the academy. But now, even though he hadn't learned extreme speed and a Dragonite's speed stat is only 80, he was still much faster than before. Reaching the academy now only took a minute. After all, his level was much higher. When I left, I was the strongest in the academy. Now that I'm back, I should be the strongest in the kingdom, right? Maybe they'll even give me a title like Guardian Dragon God or something, haha. Will couldn't help but grin as he looked at the rapidly approaching academy. To be blunt, in the entire Dragonite Kingdom, there probably wasn't a single Pokémon with a higher level than him. At most, the Pokémon of a few generals might be around his level. He descended. A large number of Pokémon had already gathered on the plains below. No one was blind, they could all see the 2 giant Pokémon arriving from the sky. They all considered this academy their territory, and now that outsiders had intruded, they felt they had to investigate. However, in the crowd below, a standing green bird Pokémon saw Iris in Will's arms and froze, its head tilting. Then, a spark of life appeared in its cloudy, vacant eyes. It flapped its wings and flew towards a small grove of trees inside the plains. Lan, look! It's Natty. Why is she flying away? Iris saw the flying Zatu and quickly pointed it out to Will. A Zatu? So it evolved, Will said, giving the peculiar Pokémon a second look. He hadn't expected Iris to have learned to send her Pokémon to the academy. But after a moment's thought, it wasn't too surprising. After all, Iris had always been smart. He used to bring her to the academy to fight all the time. Later, she had seen Liz send her other Pokémon to the academy as well. With her cleverness, even if she didn't understand the specific reason, she would know there was a benefit to doing the same. So its level is at least 25. Not bad, Will nodded to himself. Although that level wasn't high, the problem was that its trainer, Iris, was only 10 years old. By the time she reached Liz's age, 20 years from now, with her intelligence and the knowledge she had learned from him, her Zeta's level would definitely not be lower than his own current level. As for how far she could go, Will wasn't sure. He could only wait and see. The only pity was that Zeta's direct combat talent was not highly ranked in reality. Neither its stats nor its typing had anything particularly noteworthy. But that didn't mean it was useless. Because of its move pool, a Zeta could be a very powerful support player. Especially on the battlefields of this era, with armies of hundreds or thousands clashing, there was no opportunity for 1v1 duels. This gave a Zeta a great opportunity to shine. In such a battle, a powerful and competent support could have a huge impact. As for where the Zeta had flown off to, Will found out a minute later. It had gone to get the gang. When Will saw the Pokémon the Zeta brought back, his eyes lit up. The scrawny little Charmander had grown into a robust Charizard. The two frenzied Gyarados now seemed somewhat gentle, and it looked like they had become a couple. The mischievous Gligar now had a hint of a domineering aura, like a miniature Gliscor. Adding in the Golbat he had brought back this time, Liz's team was truly brand new. But the more Will looked, the more something felt off, and he finally had a sudden realization. The leader of the Dragonite clan, the founding queen of the Dragonite kingdom, of her 5 Pokémon, including Will, almost all were flying types, and the only dragon type was Will himself. And looking at Iris, her 2 Pokémon were also flying types, with not a single dragon type. Well, Gyarados and Charizard are at least half dragon, right? Chapter 88, you can know his face, but not his heart. Their growth rate is a little faster than I thought. It seems they went through a lot of hardship after I first enrolled them in the academy. I just don't know their exact strength, Will nodded to himself as he watched Charizard and the others approach. The scene that followed was a gratifying one. As Charizard's group arrived, the other Pokémon gathered on the plains automatically parted, clearing a path for them. Clearly, they had become the new bosses of this academy. Roar Char! Gligar! Roar! When the group arrived a short distance from Will, they stopped and began to loudly discuss who this strange new creature was. They felt he was somewhat familiar, but they had never seen this form before. Yet, Iris was being so affectionate with him, which left them unsure of what to think. Roar! In the end, it was Iris's Gyarados who guessed Will's true identity. Not because it was familiar with Will, but because it was familiar with Iris. The only one who would let Iris fuss over them like this, besides itself and Natty, was Will. Even Charizard and Scorp often couldn't stand Iris's antics and would run far away to avoid playing with her. Roar Char! Charizard's jaw dropped in surprise. He turned his head to get a better look. What? You don't even recognize your big bro anymore? You've gotten arrogant, haven't you? Will said, putting Iris down. He crossed his arms, put on a stern face, and frowned down at the Charizard. The feeling of authority immediately reminded Charizard of how he had felt facing Will when he was just a little Charmander. Roar Char! Confirming it was Will, Charizard swaggered forward with a comical gait and gave him a big hug. All right. You're a big dragon now, stop asking for hugs, Will said, pretending to be annoyed, but in reality, a crooked smile had already spread across his face. The real smirking Dragon King. Will had originally thought that, like Ashes, this Charizard would become arrogant after evolving. He was all prepared to beat him up and help him recognize his place as a little brother. But to his surprise, the Charizard had the exact same personality as when he was a child, he hadn't changed at all. Roar Char! Charizard flexed in front of Will, then kicked off the ground and flew into the sky, soaring proudly. Will watched him with a smile. He knew Charizard was showing off his flying ability, wanting to display his growth in front of the big bro he worshipped. That kid has wanted to fly ever since he was little, Will murmured. He watched Charizard land and fly back to him, looking at him with an expectant expression. Amazing, you did great. Will reached out a hand and rubbed Charizard's head. The Charizard now stood at 3.4 meters, not short at all, double its Pokédex value. But in front of Will, it only came up to his stomach. And because their color schemes were so similar, both with cream-colored bellies and blue-green wings, they looked like a father and son. A few hundred years ago, humans might have actually believed Dragonite and Charizard were the same species. Perfect. While we still have time, all of you attack me together. I want to test your current level, Will said, beckoning to Liz and Iris's Pokémon. The others exchanged a look and, without wasting time, immediately attacked. They also wanted to see just what level their big bro had reached in the 2 years he had been gone. Had they closed the distance between them? 5 minutes later, Charizard and the others were all lying on the ground, having thoroughly recognized their place as underlings. If Will hadn't deliberately held back to assess their strengths and weaknesses, they wouldn't have even lasted 5 minutes. A single surf or hurricane could have probably cleared the field. Golbat. The watching Golbat shook its head, completely unsurprised. Having followed Will all the way from MT Silver, it knew better than anyone just how powerful he now was. I didn't expect the strongest to be Scorp. You can know a Gligar's face, but not its heart, Will said, raising an eyebrow at the pile of defeated Pokémon. The two Gyarados were around the same level. Perhaps because they were too busy being in love, their levels weren't high, only LV32, even lower than Golbat's. Natty the Zeta was the lowest, only LV30. This didn't surprise Will, the Pokémon had never seemed very motivated. Charizard, whom he had the highest hopes for, was LV37. He had probably just evolved recently. This level was neither high nor low. You needed to be around LV40 to even qualify for the battlefield. Charizard wasn't there yet. Finally, there was the unexpected Scorp. His level was a high 40, in a league of its own. He must have been secretly putting in the work. Does he want to earn the Razor Fang from the Gliscor Alpha through his own strength? Will looked down at the defeated Gligar. No one would have thought that the Gligar who had immediately moved in for the promise of room and board actually had so much backbone. Not too bad, Will said. Overall, he was satisfied. After all, at the old academy, they would have probably only reached level 30 in 2 years. But with the revised training policy that the Dragonite Kingdom had implemented 2 years ago, the frequency of battle training from the army to the academy had increased, and the Pokémon's leveling speed had naturally followed. Will's requirements for them weren't very high. When the Great War came, it would be enough if they could reach around LV45. At that point, with these few little ones guarding Liz on the battlefield, they would be an iron wall. All right, that's enough. I didn't hit you that hard, Will said, looking at the bodies playing dead on the ground. Brine. He casually flicked a small splash of water from his hand. The cold water hit their bodies and Charizard and the others jolted awake. Scorp, tomorrow I'm taking you to Jubilance Town to find the Scyther chief and get the Razor Fang. Gligar. Scorp shook his head and patted his chest. Just as Will had thought, Scorp didn't want to rely on his power to get the item. He wanted to take it with his own strength. Will frowned. What had happened to Scorp in the last 2 years to make him change so much? A leopard can't change its spots, and that saying applied to Pokémon too. If a Pokémon's personality changed so drastically, then something major must have happened to it. Ash's Charizard, before going to the Cherrysific Valley, had been incredibly arrogant, disobedient in battles, and lazy in training. It was only after being unable to defeat even the weakest female Charizard in the valley and soaking in the water for a day and a night that it had a complete awakening and began to strive to become stronger, eventually becoming the powerhouse that could take down an Articuno. Something like that might have happened to Scorp. Will didn't press the issue, deciding to talk about it later that night. For the rest of the time at the academy, he taught Charizard and the others new skills, while also trying to figure out how to recall the moves inherited in his Dragonite genes. As evening approached, Will flew home with Charizard and the others. The two Gyarados, meanwhile, decided to stay at the Academy Lake, beginning a life of boarding school. The sight of several Pokémon flying through the sky together naturally attracted the attention of the capital's residents. They were used to it by now, but this time, the one in the lead was clearly a different, much larger creature. Everyone realized it was Lord Lan. For a time, the capital became lively again, the residents finally having some new gossip to talk about at the dinner table. Will didn't pay much attention to them. Having just returned, he suddenly found he had a lot to do and felt overwhelmed, not knowing where to start. Recall moves. Take Scorp to get the Razor Fang. Understand the current situation between the two kingdoms. These were all things he needed to do. I can only take it one step at a time, Will sighed to himself, deciding to start with the most important thing. While there was still time before dinner, he would go to Liz's study and see if he could get some information from her. Lan. He hadn't even reached the palace when Liz's voice called out. Looking down, he saw her standing in the palace courtyard, waving at them in the sky. For Will, being welcomed home by Liz was a long-missed experience. He hadn't even landed when Liz was already walking quickly towards him. Lan. When Will touched down, Liz smoothly fell into his embrace, carefully savoring the unique warmth and sense of security that came from him. Auntie. I'm staying at the palace tonight. Iris, completely ignoring the atmosphere, ran over and hugged Liz's leg, swinging back and forth. Ever since Will had left, her mother had taken her back home. Now, of course, she wanted to return to her former happy life. Living in the palace with such a large group of Pokémon would definitely be amazing. We'll have to ask your mother about that, Liz said, reaching out a hand to stroke Iris's head. Suddenly, she froze. She looked up at Will, who was hugging her, then down at Iris, who was hugging her leg, and fell into a deep thought that no one else could understand. Auntie Iris didn't notice the change in Liz and was still acting cute. You can. Hey. Iris had thought she would have to plead for a while longer. Liz's sudden agreement actually left her a little disoriented. But after a moment, she grabbed Natty and ran into the palace, afraid Liz would change her mind. Liz? Will asked, looking at her in confusion. As he understood it, Liz would usually respect Iris's mother's opinion. Why had she suddenly made the decision herself to let her stay? Chapter 89, The State of the Kingdom of the Land. Upstairs in the study, Will watched as Iris's furious mother left with a worried expression, feeling a little puzzled. Iris's mother had come storming over, not because Liz had kept Iris at the palace without permission, but because Iris had actually skipped her lessons that afternoon to come and find him. As for why she had left looking so worried, Will couldn't guess what Liz had said to her. It was just a sleepover, what was the big deal? It wasn't like she hadn't stayed over before. Click. The door opened, and Liz walked in. Lan? What they? Liz's eyes lit up when she saw Will, but then she froze, staring at the large hole in the wall. She remembered there used to be a window there. Now, there was just a gaping hole. Will stood with his hands behind his back, in the posture of a wise master. Pfft, chubby baby. Liz couldn't help but cover her mouth and giggle. She walked over and rubbed Will's belly. Then she left the study to order someone to replace the door and window with extra large ones tomorrow. What brings you here, Lan? Did you miss me too much? Liz asked gently as she came back in. With a large hole in the wall, the late autumn evening breeze was quite chilly. Feeling the cold, Liz dropped all pretense of decorum and threw herself into Will's embrace. She had 2 years of missed hugs to make up for. Don't mess around, I came to ask you something serious. What's the situation with the Kingdom of the Land? Will scooped Liz up with one arm, letting her sit on it, and then carried her to a wall in the study. On the wall, 2 maps were displayed side by side, Johto on the left, Kanto on the right. In the middle, a long mountain range MT silver separated them, represented by the gap between the 2 maps. The map had been hand-drawn by a traveling merchant and looked very rough. But Will could, based on his memory, mentally convert it to the map from the future era of leagues, which made it easier for him to understand. MT Silver was located where the Indigo Plateau would one day be. The Dragonite capital was just to its west. As for the capital of the Kingdom of the Land, Liz had marked it with an X on the map, a place that corresponded to the future Viridian city. The direct distance between the 2 capitals was actually very short, only a little further than the distance from the Dragonite capital to Jubilance town. The great road that had appeared out of nowhere a few years ago, connecting the 2 regions, was located right in the middle, south of the capitals. To the left, it connected to the vast plains of Johto, to the right, to Kanto's largest forest, the Viridian Forest. This geography presented advantages and disadvantages for both sides, with no clear superior, which made the situation somewhat dramatic. The plains made it easy for the Dragonite kingdom to advance and transport supplies, but they were difficult to defend. The Viridian Forest was a huge natural barrier for the Kingdom of the Land, but it also made it difficult for them to advance their own troops. It blocked the enemy, but it also blocked them. And yet, the plains were right at the doorstep of the peace-loving Dragonite kingdom, while the labyrinthine forest stood before the aggressive Kingdom of the Land. That was what made the geography so ironic. Night? Will asked, pointing a hand at the Kingdom of the Land's position on the map and looking at Liz on his arm. You want to know the current situation with the Kingdom of the Land? It's about time I told you. You can put me down now, Liz understood him instantly. After she was on the ground, she took several documents from her desk, glanced at them to refresh her memory, and then began to explain. A year ago, the civil war in the Kingdom of the Land officially ended. The victor, naturally, was that king of the land, Saki the White. Saki? Will's eyes widened. That's right. This was the first time since coming to the Dragonite kingdom that he had heard the true name of the Land King. Before this, no one had ever mentioned it, and Will had naturally assumed it was still ruled by the Sylph clan. When he had left 2 years ago, he had only known there was a civil war and had assumed it was due to tyranny, not that there were remnants of the old regime stirring up trouble. Hearing this now was terrifying. The feud between the future Johto champion, Lance, and the leader of Team Rocket, Giovanni, had actually begun with their ancestors 1,000 years ago. And what's more, the one at a disadvantage was the noble-born Lance, not the commoner Saki. If I hadn't appeared, who would have been the original winner of this war? The question surfaced in his mind but was quickly suppressed. Whatever the original timeline was, he would not let Liz fail now. Will's assessment of the Kingdom of the Land's threat level rose several notches. The main reason was that the Saki family produced no weaklings. Neither the future Giovanni nor his son, Silver, were people to be trifled with. Liz, meanwhile, was still explaining the situation. During their civil war, the Kingdom of the Land had also accidentally discovered that battling could accelerate a Pokémon's growth. And Saki the White was not as merciful towards Pokémon as Liz was. In his kingdom, they were still called beasts and slaves. It was a true reflection of the dark side of the Pokémon world. To quickly make up for the loss of military strength from the Civil War, Saki had implemented a number of policies. Initially, any Pokémon that resisted training or failed to meet the daily standards, along with their beast caller, would be subjected to cruel torture. Some Pokémon, not wanting their masters to suffer, would grit their teeth and endure. But there were also some beast callers who loved their Pokémon deeply and couldn't bear to see them suffer or die in the coming war, so they would secretly drive their Pokémon into the Viridian Forest. Those without families might disappear into the forest with their Pokémon. Those with families who couldn't leave would return to the city alone to bear all the consequences, so as not to implicate them. Generally, these people did not have a good end. No matter how touching their bond was, it didn't change the fact that this was desertion. Saki had never forced anyone to enlist. Everyone who joined his army had done so voluntarily. Whether they wanted to earn merit to change their status or to improve their family's life, they were all volunteers. To beg to join, take the state's resources to raise a state-assigned beast, and then secretly release it, how could Saki possibly forgive such an act? But unfortunately, despite the harsh consequences, there were still some who did this. The kingdom's military strength, instead of rising, actually fell, giving Saki a major headache and forcing him to change his policies. The first step was to lower the training quota to a level that the vast majority of Pokémon could complete. Saki had unintentionally used the anchoring effect. Compared to the past, even though the current training was still very demanding, many found it acceptable. The second step was to add rewards on top of the punishments. Failing to complete the training would still result in punishment, but exceeding the quota would earn rewards for both the Pokémon and the beast caller. The rewards weren't amazing, certainly not comparable to military honors, but for the citizens of the Land Kingdom, who lived in a harsh environment, they would strive for any resource that could make their lives easier, especially one they could earn every day. This change immediately led to a huge improvement in the kingdom's situation. Their military strength rose almost linearly, and many new recruits joined the army. This was not something the Dragonite Kingdom wanted to see. And they couldn't just copy the strategy. Their own training regimen was already quite demanding, a sudden increase would affect morale. Besides, they couldn't afford the rewards. They might be able to sustain it for a while, but not for long. At least 80% of the Land Kingdom's wealth was concentrated in Saki's hands, while Liz controlled less than 10% of her kingdom's total wealth. The difference in their societies reflected the difference between the two rulers. Kanto was full of poor, remote areas, with many villages and tribes still in existence. Only the capital, Viridian, was wealthy. And even there, you could still find people who had starved to death in the streets. In Johto, on the other hand, you could hardly find any villages or tribes. Any inhabited place was at least a town, and the larger ones were not much different from the capital. You couldn't even find beggars on the streets, let alone people who had starved. If a war broke out, Liz would even have to levy taxes on her own people. Originally, the Dragonite Kingdom had wanted to stall for time because the Kingdom of the Land had not yet discovered the method to rapidly strengthen their Pokémon. But now, not only had they discovered it, but their implementation was even more effective. The situation was now reversed. Now it was the Kingdom of the Land that wanted to stall, and the Dragonite Kingdom that did not. If we continue to delay, the Kingdom of the Land's military strength will gradually catch up to ours, and may even surpass it. So, I don't think we can delay any longer. Perhaps, this war should be started by us, Liz said, putting down the documents. She walked to the two maps, her expression grim. Do what you think you must, Will said. He didn't say more, just nodded and turned to leave the study, his own expression grave. He now had one more thing to do. He had to go and see for himself just how developed the kingdom of the land now was. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to rest easy. But this was not something to be rushed. He had to do it after he learned extreme speed. He had no desire to die over there right as the war was starting. Chapter 90, I Want to Be Strong. In the dead of night, in the palace courtyard, Will forced his eyes open. He had finally caught the one he was waiting for, Scorp, flying out of his room. His guess had been correct. For Scorp to go from LV25 to LV40 in 2 years, the time spent at the Pokémon Academy during the day was definitely not enough. Will knew very well how slow the leveling process became after LV35. So you've been sneaking out to train. Will scooped a handful of water from the courtyard fountain and splashed it on his face to wake himself up. Then, he quietly followed the Gligar as it glided into the distance. Liz was busy preparing for war, working from morning to night. She likely had no chance to notice the change in Scorp. But Will couldn't just ignore it. Although this obsessive training didn't seem to have any downsides for now, Scorp was still just a Pokémon. He might not realize the unknown effects that day and night training was having on his body and would just keep pushing himself. Training without rest, day and night, was something not even Ash would consider. Moreover, the medical standards of this era were far from those of the future. If a real problem developed, they might not even be able to diagnose it, let alone treat it. Perhaps the negative effects just hadn't shown up yet, but over time, the accumulated strain would surely lead to illness. Will had to remind Scorp not to train so blindly that he ended up hurting himself. And more importantly, he had to find out the reason for his change in mentality. Will followed Scorp across the plains until he saw a group of 5 Sneasel, active in the night. Scorp immediately began to descend. His intentions were clear, he was treating the 5 Sneasel as his prey. Fighting 5 at once? And they're ice types? You've got to be out of your mind, Will cursed under his breath, glaring at the Sneasel. In this era, a Sneasel was not a good opponent. This wasn't just for a Gligar, which was 4x weak to them, but for any Pokémon. Sneasel usually live in cold places. Now that winter was approaching and the plains were bitingly cold at night, these clawed Pokémon had come down from the snowy mountains. Most Pokémon are naturally kind and innocent, but Sneasel seems to be an exception. At least, the black Sneasel from other regions are completely different from their cuter Hisuian cousins. The Pokédex even describes them as cunning and vicious, with a cruel and treacherous nature, sometimes being loathed and cast out by their trainers. But setting aside their temperament, every Sneasel is a born fighter. They are adept at hiding in the darkness, relying on teamwork to attack their prey under the cover of night. While their typing is terrible, their stat distribution is excellent, and after evolving into Weedle, they become top-tier assassins. And against a Gligar, their type advantage is massive. That's why Will said Scorp was out of his mind. A single Gligar taking on 5 Sneasel at night, what was that if not insanity? Will had just been worried that this stubborn Gligar would suffer a major loss from its blind training, and now his fears were being realized. Will could go out and train alone because he had knowledge of these Pokémon and understood which enemies he couldn't beat. But Scorp was different. He knew nothing about Sneasel, and seeing their small size, he assumed he could win, completely ignoring the circumstances and type matchups. If he had run into a non-lethal Pokémon like an Ampharos, Arcanine, or Tauros, it might have been fine. But a Sneasel would absolutely torture and kill him after defeating him. Let this kid learn a lesson first, Will decided. He landed on the ground without making a sound and hid in the tall grass, watching as Scorp engaged the 5 Sneasel. Although the Sneasel were small, their levels were not low, probably around LV35 on average. A group of 5 together could hold their own on these plains. Even though Scorp's level was higher, he couldn't withstand their combined assault. Sneasel are masters of pack tactics. Even if they hadn't coordinated, the 5 of them could have beaten him. Gligar, a miserable cry sounded as Scorp was beaten back again and again. He already knew he was no match for them. To his credit, he wasn't a hothead and knew he had to run. But there was no way the 5 Sneasel would let him escape so easily. They pounced, dragging him down and beating him. Scared now, aren't you? Can't get away, Will shook his head from the darkness. He figured it was about time to rescue him. Thump! Thump! He didn't even have to attack. Just by standing up and taking 2 steps out of the grass, he scared the Sneasel half to death. Scorp was startled at first too, but he was too injured to fly and could only lie there pitifully as the behemoth approached. It was only when Will was right in front of him that he recognized him. Glee! Scorp froze for a moment, then pursed his lips, his eyes immediately welling up with tears. But he was stubborn. He lowered his head and cried to himself, not letting Will see. Will had intended to scold him, but seeing him like this, he stopped. He bent down and picked him up, quietly walking back towards the capital. Gligar Scorp lay in Will's arms, raising his pincers to cover his eyes. We'll put some medicine on it when we get back, and it won't hurt anymore. Glee! Scorp choked back a sob, and then began to quietly tell the story that had changed him. It had happened a year ago. At that time, Charizard was still a Charmeleon and couldn't fly. Scorp was still full of life and just wanted to play, often flying out to the nearby plains by himself. One day, he saw a little Pidgey being bullied by 7 or 8 Spearow. The innocent Scorp got angry. Having grown up under the protection of his clan, he had never seen such a thing. He charged in and beat up the Spearow. After that, he and the Pidgey became friends and would often play together. But the Pidgey had its own flock, far from the palace. Scorp wasn't worried about the Pidgey flying back by itself. But his level was the lowest of all the Pokémon, barely LV30. How could he protect it? One day, on the way back, they were attacked by a Fearow. It was strong, and so fast that they couldn't shake it. The timid Scorp panicked, flying around aimlessly. He couldn't win, and he couldn't escape. What could he do? The Pidgey, knowing it couldn't escape and not wanting to abandon its friend, decided to at least repay its debt. It charged the Fearow, tangling with it for a precious few moments and yelling at Scorp to run. In a state of panic, Scorp had listened and fled. But after flying a short distance, he came to his senses. If I fly away, what will happen to Pidgey? He immediately rushed back, even though he didn't know what he could do. But when he returned, the Fearow was gone. There was only the dead, half-eaten body of a Pidgey. That scene had a huge impact on him. For the first time, he was so clearly aware of his own weakness, of the consequences it could bring. He realized that weakness was a sin. It was the first time Scorp had ever questioned the meaning of his own existence. From that day on, he changed. He never wanted something like that to happen again. So. Glee, I want to be strong, Scorp mumbled, lying in Will's arms, crying and choking on his tears of shame. His head was still bleeding, and his wings were torn, but he no longer cared about the pain, only about his own weakness. Will stopped walking and looked down at the purple creature in his arms. Glee. Gligar. I want to be very strong. I want to protect everyone. If I had been strong enough then, Pidgey wouldn't have died. I never want anyone else to die because I'm weak. Scorp couldn't express such complex thoughts, but he knew he wanted to be strong. More than anything. He could no longer control himself. He looked up at Will and began to wail helplessly, his tears and snot streaming onto Will's chest. Will raised a soft, large hand and wiped the tears and snot from Scorp's face, then placed him on the ground. Since you've realized your own powerlessness, then you must indeed become stronger. But this road is not an easy one. Are you sure? Will's voice came from in front of him. Scorp stood obediently on the ground and looked up. Will's back was tall and filled him with a sense of security. He wanted to be a Pokémon like that too. Gligar, Scorp nodded heavily. Chapter 91, Dragon. Fast. The plains near the royal palace. Will was in mid-air, repeatedly using agility to fly back and forth, trying to get a feel for the move extreme speed. On a large, open field that he had specially cleared out, Scorp, Charizard, and the other Pokémon were being besieged by 10 Ampharos. Now that Will was back, the matter of training Scorp and the others no longer needed to be outsourced to the Pokémon Academy. Bringing the wild herds of Ampharos, Tauros, and Persian over to spar with them not only provided a higher intensity of training, but more importantly, allowed them to accumulate much more practical combat experience. How much experience could you really gain from fighting academy recruits all day? True skill could only be forged by battling against Pokémon who fought for their very survival in the wild. Scorp and the others didn't need to specifically focus on single battle experience. In the wars they would eventually participate in, there would be few opportunities for one-on-one duels. It was better to hone their teamwork and strengthen their coordination. And in that regard, the academy recruits obviously couldn't compare to a complete Pokémon herd. Besides, with Will's connections, these herds wouldn't actually kill Scorp and the others. That was the biggest guarantee. Agility is still missing something, Will sighed, feeling the wind rush past his face as he flew at high speed. The move Extreme Speed was undoubtedly closer to Quick Attack. You could even say it was an evolved version of Quick Attack. Both are normal-type physical moves that have priority in the games. The only differences are their power and PP. Extreme Speed's power is 80, double that of Quick Attack. But without a Pokémon Center or recovery items, Quick Attack can be used 30 times, while Extreme Speed can only be used 5 times. In reality, this meant that Extreme Speed was much faster and more powerful, thus causing greater damage, but it also consumed much more stamina. If he knew Quick Attack, mastering Extreme Speed wouldn't be this difficult. But the Dragonite line couldn't learn it. Phew! Will didn't know how long he had been flying. By the time he came to his senses, Charizard and the others had all been defeated. Only Scorp was still standing. Its flying/ground typing made it immune to both thunder and earthquake, so it naturally lasted longer against the pure electric type Ampharos than the others. But the Ampharos's move pool was not shallow, it was only a matter of time before Scorp was taken down. Gligar. Just then, Scorp used a Quick Attack, slamming into one of the Ampharos. The immense force knocked it back several steps, but it wasn't enough to take it out. Watching this, Will suddenly realized his own training was missing something. The most famous aspect of Extreme Speed is its speed, no doubt. But it is also an excellent offensive skill in its own right. Just practicing speed alone was not enough to master it. Let's try agility plus takedown, Will murmured to himself. He didn't like using self-damaging moves like takedown. But right now, it seemed very suitable for helping him recall Extreme Speed. First, use agility to build speed, then add the charging momentum of takedown. It should be able to achieve a degraded version of Extreme Speed's effect. The theory was sound. Now he just had to practice it. By the time he had finished his thought process, Scorp and the others had all been knocked out. Since he had anticipated this, Will had brought plenty of medicinal herbs with him and fed them to the fallen Pokémon. After a short rest, they would be able to get up and continue training. The Great War was imminent. Liz had decided to take the initiative. In this era, even kings would sometimes lead their troops personally into battle. There was not much time left for them to rest, they had to seize every second they could to train. A little physical suffering now was better than the pain of losing friends and family later. For the next 2 days, Will focused on trying to recall the move Extreme Speed. The feeling was strange. He was certain the memory of the move was in his mind, but he just couldn't access it. Fortunately, recalling is still better than learning from scratch. After a few days of practice, he finally got the feel for it. On the 5th day, the move Extreme Speed finally appeared on his personal status screen. Whew, now that I've mastered this, I can go to Dragonite Valley every day, Will grinned at his status screen. Extreme Speed not only meant he could drastically shorten his travel time to and from MT Silver, but more importantly, it meant he could escape even if he encountered a Pokémon he couldn't beat. Will was well aware that his LV-55 might be considered top tier outside of MT Silver, but in the central region, it was merely enough to survive. If he were flying through the central region and encountered a powerful flying-type Pokémon, the odds were not in his favor. But with Extreme Speed, he no longer had to worry. If he couldn't win, couldn't he still run? Only a handful of Pokémon could master Extreme Speed. Among those that could fly, besides another Dragonite, there was only the super rare Togekiss. Any other flying Pokémon, as long as it wasn't more than 10 levels higher than him, absolutely could not catch him. It might sound like an exaggeration, and before learning the move, he wouldn't have believed it himself. But after mastering it, it was a different story. The Pokédex once said that a Dragonite could circle the globe in 16 hours. Will used to think that was total bull. But now it seemed that a champion-level Dragonite that could use Extreme Speed continuously could actually do it. Perhaps Lance's Dragonite in the future could. Dragonite Capital, high above the Royal Palace. Will stretched his limbs, intending to test how long it would take him to reach the edge of MT Silver using his new move. Before, it took half an hour. Now, with a higher level and Extreme Speed, he estimated it wouldn't take more than 10 minutes. But he had to test it to know for sure. Extreme speed. Whoosh. The moment the move was activated, a white light streamed behind him, and he shot off like a skyrocket, with no warm-up needed. The residents of the palace looked up and could only see an orange streak flash across the sky. Many of them thought their eyes were playing tricks on them and rubbed them in disbelief. Oof! Will, high in the sky, was not having a good time. The fierce wind scraping against his face was actually a little painful, and the scenery was blurring past so fast that even he couldn't keep up. It's hard to control. Is my proficiency too low? Will tried to change direction in mid-air. But no matter how hard he tried, he could only manage a slight tilt. He couldn't make sharp turns or stop instantly like with quick attack. The speed was just too great. Especially since he had only used the move a few times, his body and nerves couldn't adapt to such an excessive speed in a short time. He needed to slowly raise his proficiency with the move. But say what you will, it really is fast. A worthy key to Dragonite's god-tier status, Will said, squinting his dry eyes as he raced through the air. Extreme speed was absolutely Dragonite's most core skill, bar none. It was so central to its identity that it was often jokingly called the Extreme Speed Jinchuriki or a normal-type Pokémon. No matter the generation, a Dragonite's moveset would almost always include extreme speed. After the introduction of terrestrialization, a Terranormal Extreme Speed became the standard for Dragonite to dominate the competitive scene. It was only after mastering Extreme Speed that a Dragonite could truly be called Dragon. Fast. I need to start stopping. Seeing the outer forest at the foot of Mt. Silver already in his sights, Will began to try his best to halt his momentum and slow down. But it was much harder than he thought. It was like sprinting a 50-meter dash and then trying to stop on a dime. His body just wouldn't obey his mind. He could only do his best to gradually decrease his speed. This is bad, Will muttered, seeing the rapidly approaching forest. The next moment. Boom! Will crashed into the forest like a meteorite, snapping 5 or 6 giant trees in half and ploughing a trench more than 10 meters long in the ground. Ouch! Ouch! The sharp pain that shot through his body felt as if he had just used double edge. He hadn't expected that a poorly controlled extreme speed could cause backlash damage. He had to increase his proficiency with this move as quickly as possible. He didn't need to be able to make 90-degree turns, but at the very least, he had to be able to stop perfectly at his target location. He climbed up from the ground and looked himself over. At most, he had a few small scrapes, he wasn't even bleeding. A Dragonite's body was sufficiently tough. Let's fly back. Will casually picked up a few berries that had been knocked from the trees and popped them in his mouth. Then, without stopping, he used extreme speed again and flew back towards the palace. This time, he was more cautious, starting to decelerate when he was still 200 meters away. Better to slow down too early than to accidentally crash into the palace and kill Liz. About 13 minutes. Will came to a stop and lay panting on the courtyard lawn. A dozen or so minutes of extreme speed wasn't his limit, but the move was certainly exhausting. According to his count, a round trip to Mt. Silver had taken 13 minutes. But that included the crash and the early deceleration. Once he had mastered the move, he should be able to cut that time down to 10 minutes. As a Dragonair, a round trip had taken him an hour. He was now about 6 times faster. Chapter 92, Objective, Razor Fang. From the palace to Mt. Silver is about 100 kilometers, so 200 kilometers round trip, that means my speed is about 1200 km/h. Will used a claw to scribble some calculations in the dirt. The result startled him. He hadn't expected his speed to be faster than that of a commercial airliner. It was already at the minimum threshold for a supersonic jet. No wonder his reaction time couldn't keep up while flying, the sudden acceleration was too much to adapt to. I'm LV 55 now. If I can reach LV 100, my speed should at least double. Factoring in my own training, it should be at least 2,500 km per hour. Can a Dragonite really circle the Earth in 16 hours? Will was completely awestruck by the potential of his species. Of course, the reality wouldn't be so simple. First, even a LV 100 Dragonite might not have the stamina to use extreme speed continuously for 16 hours. Will had already experienced firsthand how draining the move was. But he had no idea how much stamina a LV 100 Dragonite possessed. Second, you had to consider weather factors. One area might be scorching hot, the next caught in a downpour. It was impossible not to be affected. So, the Pokédex's claim was likely just an idealized conclusion based on its calculated top speed. No Dragonite could probably ever actually do it. Unless, it was that ancient Dragonite from the lighthouse in the anime. Maybe that one could give it a shot. But even so, it was still shocking. A Dragonite's speed was no joke. It was the most fitting name the Pokémon professors of the future could have given it after scientific calculation. It truly lived up to its name. Okay, first I'll take Scorp to the Gliscor, then I can start traveling back and forth to Dragonite Valley to learn moves, Will finalized his plan. Although Scorp wanted to earn the Razor Fang from the Gliscor Alpha through his own efforts, with war imminent, there was no time to wait for him to grow strong enough to win that fight. From Will's current perspective, the Gliscor Alpha was already around LV50 2 years ago, a 10-level gap. For Scorp to reach LV50 would take at least another 2 years. Right now, they needed to seize every opportunity to quickly increase their combat power. When a Gligar evolves into a Gliscor, the massive boost in its base stats causes a qualitative change in its power. And, of course, a Gliscor's deeper move pool could not be ignored. Scorp's current combat power wasn't much stronger than Charizard's, there was almost no difference. A Gligar's low base stats were a major reason. Another was that Charizard's fire/flying typing was also excellent, on par with Gligar's ground/flying. A fight between them would likely favor Charizard's typing. With these two factors, the 3-level gap between them was almost negligible. But once Scorp evolved, that stat gap would be hugely reduced, and their strength would clearly diverge. No sooner said than done. Will immediately went to find Scorp, who was currently getting beaten up by the Tauros herd. Without a word, he grabbed Scorp's tail and shot off towards the palace with extreme speed. But before they left, he had to go see Liz. The journey to Jubilance Town was much farther than to MT Silver, he wouldn't be able to make it back in a single day. If he left without telling her, Liz, with her personality, wouldn't get angry or cry, but she would definitely be very sad. She was the type of woman who would never show her weakness, always keeping it hidden in her heart to deal with on her own. He dragged the bewildered Scorp to the second-floor study window. The window had now been replaced with a massive one that took up half the wall, made especially for him. Tap, tap. Will gently tapped the glass with his claws. Liz, hearing the sound, looked over, then immediately stood up and came to push the huge window open. Lan? Why are you dragging Scorp around? Look at him, Liz asked, looking at Will strangely. Will looked down and saw that the Gligar in his grasp had swirly eyes. It was probably because he was already in bad shape, and then the sudden, dizzying flight was too much for him, so he had fainted. Ugh, it's fine. He'll be alright after a moment, Will said, tilting his head and placing Scorp on the floor. What are you here for? Liz asked, first coming over for her routine hug before speaking. She knew that Will was usually training and wouldn't come looking for her unless it was for something. And she also knew that he was aware of how busy she was, so he wouldn't come unless it was important. I need to take Scorp to Jubilance Town. You should understand, Will said, leading Liz to the map. He pointed to a spot off the coast of Jubilance Town. On the map, it was just open sea. But Liz took a closer look and understood that he was pointing to the island they had visited before. She remembered that it was full of Scorp's kin, and a particularly large leader. You want to take Scorp there? Yes, Will nodded. How long will you be gone? You're not going to be gone for a long time again, are you? 3 days at most, Will said, holding up 3 fingers. Or, more accurately, 3 claws. In reality, if he went by himself, it would probably only take a day. But he himself was still not used to the speed of extreme speed, let alone carrying Scorp. He also planned to have Scorp get some free experience from the Gliscor Alpha after he evolved. 3 days. Yes. Alright then. Come back soon. Oh, right, could you take a letter to Elder Barb for me? Liz said, reluctantly agreeing after confirming he wouldn't be gone for long. She then took a letter from her desk drawer. Will didn't have to guess to know it was related to the impending war. As the coastal city closest to the Land Kingdom's capital, Jubilance Town would inevitably be impacted by the war, whether Liz had plans to send troops by sea or not. So, she certainly had things to discuss with the town's mayor. However, Liz probably thought Will wouldn't be able to hold a letter properly, so she found a satchel, hung it around his neck, placed the letter inside, and locked it securely. Got it, Will nodded, and then left, dragging the still unconscious Scorp with him. He had to get him healed up before they could set out. That wasn't hard to solve. In the past 2 years, the Dragonite Kingdom's Pokémon Research Institute had developed an ointment from medicinal herbs. Its effect wasn't as good as applying the crushed herbs directly, but it was much more material efficient, greatly increasing the utilization rate of the herbs. For Scorp's current injuries, a direct application might require 10 plants to fully heal, as much of the medicinal power would evaporate or fall off. But with the ointment, 1 box was enough. It was easy to apply and didn't fall off, and 1 box only required 1 plant to make. This ointment was still not as perfect as the sprays of the future, but it was extremely good for the current era. By the afternoon, Scorp had not only woken up but was fully recovered and full of energy. "Let's go. I'm taking you to the Gliscor to get the Razor Fang," Will said to him. "Glee." Scorp tilted his head. He didn't think he could beat the Gliscor Alpha yet. "I'll fight him," Will said, puffing out his chest. The Gliscor had said it didn't have to be Scorp who beat him, Will could do it too. "Gligar. There's no time to wait. We're about to go to war with another country. Countless enemies will be coming. With your current strength, you'll only be able to watch as Liz and the others die." Glee. Scorp had never heard this from Liz and was suddenly afraid. But the thought of Liz and the others filled him with courage, and he stopped arguing with Will. "Let's go." "Gligar," Scorp nodded obediently. The travel speed of 2 flying-type Pokémon was, naturally, incomparable to that of ordinary horses. A journey that would take a horse 5 or 6 days, Will and Scorp could fly in 1. And that was with Scorp sometimes running out of stamina and needing to be carried. Otherwise, they might have arrived by evening. "Let's rest here for today. We should reach Jubilance Town by morning tomorrow," Will said. They had landed on a plain near the town. Exhausted from a full day of travel, they both collapsed in a heap and fell asleep not long after. The next morning, they woke up and continued on their way, arriving in Jubilance Town in less than an hour. Elder Barb was an early riser. Most of the town's residents hadn't even opened their doors yet, but she was already out front, sweeping her courtyard with a broom. She wasn't too startled to see Will and Scorp fly down from the sky, mainly because she recognized Scorp. Although it was her first time seeing Will, news of what had happened in the capital had already reached the nearby Jubilance Town. So, it only took her a few seconds to deduce that this fat dragon was Lan. "Long time no see, Lan, Scorp. You've come, does Liz have business?" Elder Barb asked, walking forward and spotting the bag around Will's neck. "Yes," Will said, pulling off the small bag and handing it to her. "Thank you for your trouble, looks like you haven't missed any meals these past 2 years, hehe. To be able to eat is a blessing. Grandma likes to see you looking chubby," Elder Barb said, taking out the letter and putting it away safely. She didn't read it right away, but instead walked over and patted Will's big belly. Old people always like to see children looking plump, they find it cute and cuddly, and Elder Barb was no exception. "Ugh. Elder Barb, we have to go," Will said, turning as if to leave. Leaving already? Won't you stay for a meal?" The moment she said that, Scorp immediately ran over and grabbed Will with both pincers. Glee. Chapter 93, Gligar's Evolution. In the afternoon, after being kept for a meal by Elder Barb, Will and Scorp set off again. For Scorp, enduring hardship was one thing, but being deprived of a meal was a tragedy that would bring him to tears. They flew in silence, heading straight for the isolated island. The island was very close to Jubilance Town. At their flight speed, it took less than 10 minutes to reach the shore. A few Gligar flew out from the forest as usual. Some of them recognized Will and Scorp and immediately flew back to the central nest to report. Before long, the Gliscor Alpha arrived with a large number of its kin. It seemed the Alpha intended for the others to watch. Gligar Scorp waved his pincers happily in greeting when he saw his old man. He looked just like a child who hadn't grown up. Gliscor, the Alpha looked at his son for a moment, seeming to notice something, but just nodded without saying much. As a father, how could he not see the changes in his own child? But this was something that had to be experienced, no Pokémon could escape it. Then the Gliscor Alpha shifted its gaze to Will, sizing him up. Gliscor. That's right. That's why we've come, Will replied to the Alpha's unspoken question. Gliscor, the Alpha said, waving a pincer at a Gligar behind him. The Gligar immediately came forward, holding a huge leaf. On the leaf rested a yellowish, sharp fang, over 10 centimeters long. Score. The alpha picked up the fang and tossed it to Will. We don't have to accept your challenge. Will asked, raising an eyebrow. He passed the fang to Scorp. Scorp wouldn't evolve immediately after taking it, he had to wait until nightfall. Score. The alpha shook its head lazily, stating frankly that it was no longer a match for Will. There was no need to fight. Thank you, by the way, recently. Considering this was Scorp's home and his clan was here, Will repeated the warning he had given to the old Scyther. Score. The alpha's answer was completely different from the Scythers. The Scyther clan moved around MT Silver constantly, they had no particular attachment to any one place and would have no psychological barrier to relocating. But the Score clan had lived on this isolated island since birth. They were deeply attached to this place. Even if the human war were to reach them, they would not leave. Can we stay here for today? I'd like to ask you to teach Scorp some tips on using the fang moves. I'm afraid he won't be able to learn them on his own later. Will didn't waste any more words on the topic of their territory. In reality, there wasn't much to worry about. As long as the Dragonite kingdom was the victor, this island would be fine. Score. The alpha nodded and turned, beckoning for Will and Scorp to follow. Scorp was no stranger here. He followed the alpha and began to greet the other Gligar, chattering away, likely telling them about his experiences over the past 2 years. The other Gligar listened, their eyes shining, and some began to think about venturing out into the world themselves. Will, meanwhile, was observing the island. The number of Gligar was enormous. He had seen at least 100 on his way in, and that was probably only a fifth of the total population, or even less. It was clear that this clan had lived here for a very, very long time and had never encountered any natural enemies. The only thing that could cause major losses to a clan of this size would be a natural disaster. There was another thing. Will noticed that the alpha was the only Score on the entire island. It was impossible that it only had one razor fang, it definitely had others. The alpha must be restricting the evolution of the other Gligar. The reason was unknown, but it was not impossible that it was to maintain its own rule, which was very important for an alpha in the wild. Scorp was leaving with Will and wouldn't be back for a long time, so his evolution posed no threat to the alpha's position. That was why it had not been restricted. Of course, there might be other reasons that Will couldn't guess and that weren't recorded in the Pokédex. Wait, are you guys intentionally planting these? Suddenly, as they passed a clearing, Will asked the alpha in surprise. He saw a few Gligar planting saplings, while others were watering them with large leaves. This truly shocked Will. He had just been wondering if this clan, reproducing without any predators, would one day face internal strife due to a lack of resources. But if they had mastered the skill of agriculture, that day could be greatly delayed. If they could hold out until the era of leagues, that day might never come at all, as an endless stream of trainers would come to the island to catch Gligar, and with each one that left, the island's resources would become more plentiful. Score. The alpha glanced over and explained a little more. Their ancestors had once spied on humans plowing fields and planting crops on the plains. So, they had tried to practice it on this island, and the tradition had been preserved to this day. But for some unknown reason, their success rate was not high, and many of the saplings would wither and die. Will took a closer look and immediately understood why. These Gligar were just planting the saplings and watering them daily. They did nothing else. Naturally, it couldn't compare to human farming. But for Pokémon to have achieved even this much was already very impressive. Continuing deeper, Will found that the island's scenery was quite nice, it wasn't just a simple forest as he had imagined. In the center was a small mountain that had even formed a small waterfall, which flowed into a lake that connected to the sea. It could truly be called a place of beautiful mountains and clear waters. This is indeed a suitable place to live, Will praised. Although his soul was still human, he had lived 2 lives as a Pokémon. From a Pokémon's perspective, this place was extremely nice. Score. The alpha couldn't help but smile. Hearing his home praised made him happy. He now looked at Will much more favorably. He called over several small Gligar to bring all sorts of fruits to serve them, and even had 2 female Gligar come over to give Will a massage by gently tapping his back with their pincers. However, to Will, it just felt like a light scratching. And he couldn't appreciate the beauty of the 2 Gligar from a Pokémon's perspective. At most, from a human's perspective, the 2 delicate-looking Gligar were somewhat cute. If he could choose, he would of course prefer to be massaged by 2 beautiful human women. Beautiful women. Will raised his head and thought for a moment. He really hadn't seen many beautiful women since coming to this world. The adult women of this era had mostly experienced the hardships of the tribal period, so their skin wasn't the best. Liz was already the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, but even she had a few small flaws. For example, now that she was approaching 30, a few crow's feet were starting to appear at the corners of her eyes. It was probably due to overwork. Besides her, Iris's mother, that hot-tempered woman, was also a beauty, though she seemed to have been a warrior in the past, and the muscles on her arms and legs slightly affected her aesthetic. But judging by the mother's looks, Iris would grow up to be a beauty no less than Liz. Gliss score. The Alpha's voice brought Will back to the present. He turned and saw that it had already begun teaching Scorp the experience of the three fangs, Thunder Fang, Ice Fang, and Fire Fang. They were the counterpart to the farmer's 3 punches that a Dragonite could master. But the punches were superior to the fangs in both power and accuracy. And in reality, the punches were much more convenient to use. You could use a fire punch with your left hand and an ice punch with your right. Could you do that with fangs? And biting was just too clumsy, at least for a species like Dragonite. Gligar, Scorp tried, but couldn't get the feel for it at all. This didn't surprise Will. If it could be learned just by watching, then Scorp would be a genius among geniuses. He didn't expect him to learn it right away. Once Scorp evolved into a Gliscor, the memory of the 3 fangs would be etched deep within him, waiting to be recalled, just like his own extreme speed. With the Alpha's guidance now, when the time came, Scorp would only need to recall it for a moment to master the moves. Scorp trained with the Alpha for the rest of the afternoon. When night fell, "Scorp, it's about time. Pick up the Razor Fang." Gligar. Scorp nodded obediently and took the Razor Fang in his hand. The light of evolution began to shine. The brilliant light attracted many of the surrounding Gligar, who peeked out to watch. For many of them, it was their first time seeing a Gligar evolve. When the light faded, a majestic Gliscor stood before Will. Scorp opened his eyes. In the darkness, his golden eyes shone like 2 luminous pearls. At the same time, 2 or 3 sparks suddenly erupted from his teeth. Then, with a whoosh, his fangs burst into raging flames. He had mastered Fire Fang immediately upon evolving. He's been around Charizard for so long, he's seen a lot of fire-type moves, so he has a better feel for Fire Fang. Will nodded. Tomorrow, when the sun rises, they could set out for the capital. Chapter 94, The Elemental Punches. The return journey the next day was much faster. For one, Scorp was faster as a Gliscor, but more importantly, his stamina and ability to control the wind had greatly improved. Will also noticed something he hadn't before. As a Gligar, its pincers and wings were connected, which meant that when it attacked with its pincers, it was difficult to maintain its glide. It had to choose between attacking and gliding. But after evolving into a Gliscor, the 2 actions could coexist. Its pincers were completely separate from its wings, so their movement didn't interfere with each other. This was a combat enhancement you could only really discover in the real world. They set out early in the morning and were back at the palace by evening, nearly twice as fast as their trip out. The new Gliscor, sensing its own changes, danced with excitement upon their return, constantly showing off its new form to Liz and Charizard. "Gliscor, you and Charizard, go outside and have a battle." Will glanced at Charizard's not particularly concerned expression and decided to make them fight. Before, Charizard was only a tiny bit weaker than Scorp, a nearly imperceptible difference, so he probably thought he could surpass him after gaining another 2 levels. But now, Will felt it was necessary for the Gliscor to thoroughly crush Charizard's arrogance and make him recognize the gap between them, lest he become too complacent. There's a saying, "Don't let pride blind you." Because of his past knowledge, Will had always been more partial to Charizard. He had always assumed that, aside from himself, Charizard would be the strongest Pokémon under Liz's command in the future. But now it seemed that if Charizard maintained this leisurely attitude, he would sooner or later be left far behind by Gliscor. In the future, Gliscor would be Liz's strongest general. Gliscor. The Gliscor excitedly raised its pincers and charged out without hesitation. It was eager to test its new strength and see just how much it had changed. Charizard yawned and flew out confidently. "You all go and watch too," Will told the other Pokémon. This was to put pressure on Charizard, and also to see if he could inspire a desire to become stronger in the others. "I want to go too." Iris didn't even wait for Will to ask. she just rode her a little splasher and followed them out. Once they had all left, Liz's expression gradually grew complicated. Lan. What is it? Will glanced at Liz, surprised to see such an expression on her face. It seemed something had happened that she had to do but found difficult. Well, in a few days, there might be something I need to ask you to do. What is it? Just say it. It's rather dangerous, but there are not many Pokémon who can do it. I need you to help me scout a relatively safe sea route that will allow our army to reach the land of Kanto from Jubilance Town with minimal losses. Liz frowned as she looked at him. It was clear she didn't really want him to do this. In her eyes, it was very dangerous. It would require him to go underwater to observe the distribution of Pokémon. If he encountered a powerful Pokémon, his life would be at risk. But there truly weren't many who could accomplish such a task. Will could fly in the sky and swim in the sea. Even if he encountered an unbeatable opponent underwater, he could fly away. Entrusting this matter to him would minimize the losses. Is that all? Leave it to me, Will said, agreeing with a casual wave of his hand. What seemed dangerous to Liz was not dangerous at all to him. There were definitely many Pokémon in the ocean that could beat him, but they were mostly in the deep sea. The shipping lane he needed to scout wouldn't be too far from the coast. The probability of encountering a Pokémon above LV55 was very low. Besides, he had mastered extreme speed. It would be a bit too embarrassing to be killed by a sea-dwelling Pokémon now. You must be careful, Liz said, stepping forward to hug him, her voice tinged with anxiety. I don't want to involve you in the war, but the Dragonite Kingdom really needs your strength. I said I'd help you achieve your dream. If you don't let me participate in the war, wouldn't my efforts for the past 2 years have been for nothing? Will said, patting her back. I am currently mobilizing troops to go to Jubilance Town. They will take the sea route to Kanto and then flank the enemy from behind when the main battle breaks out. The whole process will take about a month. You just need to find the route within that time. Understood. By the time Will and Liz had finished their discussion, the battle between Gliscor and Charizard was over. The Gliscor was visibly ecstatic. In contrast, the Charizard seemed to have turned grey, but the flame on its tail was burning fiercely. His fighting spirit has been ignited, Will thought, nodding with satisfaction as he looked at the flame on Charizard's tail. Every Charizard has its own personality. Ash's was very proud and arrogant, and its reaction to defeat was extreme. When it was thrown into the lake in the Cherrycific Valley, it was so devastated it almost let its tail flame go out, nearly dying. It was only after a long period of training there that it regained its confidence, this time backed by real power, able to defeat even an Articuno. But Liz's Charizard was different. Ever since it was a Charmander, it had been full of life, optimistic, and always looking forward to tomorrow, stubbornly chasing its dream of flying. So, even though it was defeated today, it wouldn't be crushed. It would still look forward to tomorrow, to becoming a little stronger, and to the day it would surpass Gliscor. Keep up the good work, Will said, not saying much more. He walked over, patted Charizard's shoulder, and then left. Charizard nodded. Will was the big bro he admired most. With his encouragement, he felt he would be fine. The next day, Will didn't rush to the sea to scout the route. At his current speed and strength, the process would take 10 days at most. He still had 20 days to spare. He planned to use this time to travel back and forth to MT Silver, learning moves from the Dragonite chief during the day, and then coming back at night to review and train Gliscor and the others. The war will most likely arrive in 2 or 3 months. There isn't much time left. With a slight sense of urgency, Will used extreme speed early in the morning and flew to MT Silver. In Dragonite Valley, it had been a year since he had last left, back when he was still a Dragonair. When he appeared in the valley again, even without him saying a word, the Dragonite there quickly guessed it was him. Knight, the Dragonite chief said, looking at Will, who was now almost as tall as he was. He nodded forcefully, expressing his admiration. He hadn't expected a kinsman who had grown up alone outside the clan to reach such a level. In the entire world, besides himself, you couldn't find a second Dragonite taller than Will. Ying, a voice sounded by his ear. At the same time, Will felt a cool serpent coiling up his leg and around his body. A moment later, the face of the female Dragonair appeared before him. Long time no see, Will said, raising a hand in greeting, not minding that she had wrapped herself around him. Although in his eyes, most Dragonair looked the same, he could still recognize that this was the one who had a crush on him. It seemed that now he was even more charming. Besides this Dragonair, other Dragonite and Dragonair also wanted to come and get close, but they were all driven away by the one currently wrapped around him. I came specifically to ask you to teach me some moves. I may have to bother you for a while, Will said, ignoring the Dragonair and addressing the chief. He felt a little embarrassed to keep coming here for help, but he didn't have anything to offer them in return right now. He could only say that if the Dragonite clan ever encountered danger in the future, the Dragonite kingdom would provide what help it could. Dragonite, the chief was as generous as ever and didn't mind teaching him at all. They were usually bored in the valley anyway, this gave him something to do. Thank you. Knight. At that moment, the chief suddenly asked Will if he had seen anything unusual on his flight over. I didn't notice anything. What's wrong? Dragonite the chief spread his arms. He said that the underground ruler of MT Silver had been in a bad mood lately, causing some tremors in the mountain. Will shook his head, puzzled. If the Dragonite chief didn't know what was going on, how could he? For the next 20 days, Will came to Dragonite Valley every morning and returned to the palace in the evening. During this time, he successively recalled 3 moves, Fire Punch, Wing Attack, and Thunder Punch. He also learned the non-native move, Ice Punch. At the same time, with his daily high-speed travel, his proficiency with extreme speed grew higher and higher. He might not be able to drift mid-flight, but he could at least stop wherever he wanted. The war between the human kingdoms is about to begin. I don't know when we'll meet again. You all take care, Will said on his last evening, bidding farewell to the Dragonite chief. He didn't say much else. With the Dragonite clan's location and environment, even if a war broke out, it wouldn't affect them. He gave the female Dragonair the same farewell as last time, as long as we're alive, we'll see each other again. Chapter 95, Entering the Kanto region. Scouting the sea route was a boring affair. At first, Will found it fun to swim around underwater and look at the different aquatic Pokémon. But after a while, it started to get tedious because 99% of the Pokémon in this sea area were water types from the Kanto and Johto Pokédexes. There were some from other regions, but they were few and far between. Seeing the same Pokémon over and over again naturally became tiresome. If he were exploring the unknown depths of the deeper ocean, perhaps he would have found it more interesting. But constantly surveying the shallow coastal areas was, of course, dull. It's quite safe, though. There aren't any particularly powerful Pokémon. Will set out from the coast of Jubilance Town and headed east. Along the way, he didn't encounter any Pokémon he couldn't beat, the strongest he found were only around LV40. What he encountered more often were the local Pokémon herds. Among them were some aggressive and troublesome groups, like a swarm of Tentacruel. Considering that the army might be attacked by them when passing through, Will took the initiative to give them a round of shock therapy, forcibly driving them to another area. The Tentacruel species was rather pitiful, really. The Pokédex describes them as, when they appear in large numbers, which is rare, all the fish Pokémon in the surrounding waters disappear. Because of this, many uninformed trainers assume that Tentacruel indiscriminately attack any fish Pokémon around them, even killing them when they're not hungry. Combined with the fact that they aren't particularly beautiful and their fighting style seems quite cruel, they don't kill their prey immediately but inject it with venom that causes sharp pain, allowing it to weaken in agony. Their reputation wasn't very good, even in the era of leagues. An ordinary trainer would never consider catching a Tentacle or Tentacruel to raise. But in reality, the species was misunderstood. They usually live in complex underwater rock formations and won't attack unless you enter their territory or provoke them. Misty, a lover of water-type Pokémon in the anime, knew this very well, which was why she immediately refused when a rich old woman wanted to hire Ash and his friends for $1 million to drive away a swarm of Tentacle. There was also a funny scene in the anime where a Tentacruel strolling in a river and another strolling on land accidentally met, and both were so scared of each other that they ran for their lives, as if they had seen a doppelganger. Many signs indicated that the Tentacruel line was no different from any other Pokémon and was actually quite cute. As for why the Tentacruel here were driven away by Will, it was out of necessity. Their territory just happened to be right on the sea route he had planned. He didn't want to make a special detour, as who knew what trouble might be lurking in more distant waters. So, he could only drive them away. To humans, a Tentacruel was one of the most terrifying predators in the sea. If you were caught by their tentacles and dragged into the water, you couldn't live and couldn't die. It was precisely because humans lost most of their ability to resist once they entered the sea that they had always feared it so much. If Will hadn't been powerful enough and skilled in underwater combat, the Dragonite Kingdom might not have had anyone who could take on the task of scouting the sea route, and Liz would have had to abandon her plan for a flanking maneuver. But it was also for this reason that Liz believed the Kingdom of the Land would never expect them to attack from the sea. Given their situation over the past few years, having to deal with the external threat of the Viridian Forest and internal threats within their own country, they absolutely would not have had the spare capacity to worry about the ocean. Scouting, no, it should be said that pioneering the sea route was much faster than Will had expected. In just 3 days, he had opened a sea passage from Jubilance Town to the land of Kanto. All he had to do now was come back and check it once more a day or two before the army set out. What should I do with the rest of the time? Why don't I sneak into the Kanto region and see? Maybe I can gather some intelligence, Will thought, an idea forming in his mind. The next day, he flew from the sea into the Kanto region. However, he didn't rashly enter the capital of the Land Kingdom, the future Viridian city. He chose to head further east, to a coastal city that would one day become a world-famous metropolis, Fuchsia City. Fuchsia City's fame wasn't just due to the Poison-type Elite Four member, Koga, but mainly because it was home to the Kanto region's largest safari zone. The safari zone was a general term for special wild Pokémon reserves found in various regions. They contained many rare wild Pokémon, and often Pokémon from non-native regions would appear there. What made these places special was that trainers could pay a fee in exchange for special Pokeballs and enter to catch Pokémon. Any method was allowed, except for battling. But the Fuchsia city of now was probably just Fuchsia town at best, or even a village. I think I'll pass Cinnabar Island on the way, but never mind. The people of this era don't dare to leave the mainland for too long. They probably haven't even discovered its existence yet. It's likely a Pokémon paradise, Will thought, glancing south but giving up on the idea of a detour. If he ran into Groudon, that would be a real mess. Cinnabar Island had a volcano, and at some point in the future, it would erupt without warning, completely annihilating the town. No one knew why it erupted, and Will had no intention of investigating at this point in time. Any isolated island with a volcano could be Groudon's bedroom, and he couldn't guarantee that the Groudon of this era wasn't using Cinnabar's volcano as its bed. He continued to fly forward. Even with the boost from extreme speed, it still took him a considerable amount of time to fly from Jubilance to Fuchsia. He had set out in the morning and arrived around noon. But this was within his expectations. The journey from Jubilance to Fuchsia was nearly 2/3 of the way across the Kanto region. When he saw the ground, he didn't land right away but flew around for a while longer. It took some time before he finally spotted Fuchsia City. This can only be called Fuchsia Village, Will thought, shaking his head. He landed in a small grove of trees surrounding the settlement. This Fuchsia village looked just like Pallet Town from the anime. The houses were spaced several miles apart, and he could see some humans farming in the fields. Hey! Where did this big guy come from? Are you here for something to eat? Suddenly, a voice from nearby made Will jump. He turned his head and saw a young man with purple hair in a short tree. Whoa, you're huge! Where did you come from? The person then jumped down from the tree and came over to Will, sizing him up. Roar! Will spread his arms and roared at the person. You're hungry? To his surprise, the young man wasn't scared at all. He looked down at Will's stomach, then frowned and took out a few berries. You look like you can eat a lot. This should hold you over for now. Will took the berries and started gnawing on them. It was lunchtime, and he was indeed a little hungry. As for why this man wasn't afraid of him, well, I guess every world has some naturally bold hotheads, Will could only conclude. Haha, come with me. But you can't roar like that again, okay, you're so big, you might scare the other little ones, the young man said with a smile, patting Will's belly and gesturing for him to follow. Will looked at him curiously. If he wasn't mistaken, this person wanted to take him into the village. To be honest, he thought his appearance would scare the other people to death. What are you standing there for? Don't be afraid. Everyone here is very nice. They won't dislike you, the young man said, turning back and waving, a bright, sunny smile on his face. I'll just have a look. Will hesitated for a moment, then began to follow. He felt this person was very strange, but he didn't seem to be the same type of hothead as Ash. Perhaps following him would shed some light on the situation. And what happened next left him completely stunned. Yo, where'd you pick up this big baby? You've got guts, Ren, bringing such a huge beast home. Aren't you afraid it'll eat you out of house and home? Yet, look at the size of that belly. It could probably fit my tank in it. As the young man, Ren, led him through the village, the surrounding villagers were not only unafraid but even started to tease him. They didn't look at Will like a beast, but more like a small cat or dog. And Will noticed something else. From their words, it seemed that the villagers of Fuchsia village were all raising, no, it should be said, living alongside Pokémon. What was going on? Will looked at the young man beside him in shock. He remembered that the attitude towards Pokémon in the Kingdom of the Land wasn't supposed to be this good. This village was not ordinary. We're almost there. My house is just ahead, Ren said, pointing to a small wooden hut. The hut was so small that Will probably couldn't even fit inside. And yet, in the small yard of this poor-looking young man, he was raising several special Pokémon. Chapter 96, I have to fight for them. A Weedle with a broken horn. A Rattata with a missing front tooth. A Meowth with a tail that had been severed for some unknown reason. The most normal-looking Pokémon was a Growlithe that was blind in one eye. To put it bluntly, aside from the Growlithe, the other 3 Pokémon would have been culled from the gene pool in the wild. A Weedle without its weapon, a Rattata missing its fang, a Meowth that had lost its tail for balance. How could they survive out there? Apart from their various issues, the little ones were not small in stature. Their fur was a bit rough, probably from a poor diet, but from the looks of them, they were at least getting enough to eat. Clearly, this incredibly bold young man, Ren, had saved these lucky little ones. Of course, you could also say that Ren was the lucky one. After all, a Pokémon like Growlithe was quite rare. In this era, and even in the near future, its evolution, Arcanine, was even referred to as a legendary Pokémon, and was described in the Pokédex as a majestic Pokémon from ancient Eastern legends. Not to mention its high 555 base stat total and handsome appearance. Looking at the species alone, Growlithe was an extremely excellent Pokémon. They are naturally loyal, brave, friendly, intelligent, and obedient. To have earned a Growlithe's acknowledgement meant that Ren was a trainer it would recognize for life. Come here, puppy, let me see, Will said, walking over to the Growlithe. He picked up the completely non-vigilant creature and stared into its blind eye. The entire pupil was grey. It was most likely a congenital defect, not a later injury. An eye like this would be difficult to heal, the only hope would be through evolution. There was a big storm that day. This little guy came out of nowhere, ran into my field, and ate a whole bunch of my corn. I was so mad. But he was so weak he was about to pass out, so I didn't hold it against him, Ren said, walking out of his hut holding a large bundle of steaming hot corn on the cob. This must be the food he grew himself. He distributed the cobs to the little ones, then stuffed 2 into Will's hands. After that, the little guy just decided to stay at my place, Ren said, taking a bite of his corn. He reached out and rubbed the Growlithe's head, and the puppy comfortably lay on the ground, rolled onto its back, and wagged its tail. You seem to like them a lot. Will sat down on the ground with a loud thump, which scared the nearby Meowth so badly it shot up onto the roof. Ren seemed to have rarely met someone he could talk to like this, so he began to chatter away at the massive Dragonite. I've been alone since I was little, raised by everyone in the village. With them around, I'm not lonely anymore, so I've never driven them away. Of course, I know they're what the big shots call primal beasts, but I don't think they're that scary. And hey, don't look down on them because they're small. They're amazing. All the green bugs that used to ruin the crops? They're the ones who chased them away. The villagers who didn't like them before had their impressions completely changed because of that. Now everyone has adopted 1 or 2 beasts for their own fields. Ren told Will his story as he gnawed on his corn, watching the sun. In the process, Will came to understand why the people in this village were not afraid of Pokémon at all. But it's a pity, in a few days, I'll have to leave them. I'll have to ask the uncles and aunts in the village to take care of them, Ren suddenly sighed, his eyes filled with reluctance as he looked at the Growlithe. Why? Where are you going? Will knew Ren couldn't understand his words, but he could use an inquisitive tone to let him sense his curiosity and confusion. He then took another bite of his corn. He'd never eaten it straight off the cob in this world before. At the palace, he'd only had corn milk and corn cake. The capital is recruiting soldiers. I'm going to enlist, achieve great things, and become a big shot. Will's chewing abruptly stopped. He turned to look at the young man beside him and said casually, "You're asking to die." He wasn't trash-talking. In his view, he was simply stating a fact. A war between two nations would inevitably result in countless casualties, especially for the fragile humans. When the war began, regardless of whether the Dragonite or Land Kingdom won, the human death toll would be in the tens of thousands at least. Ren was just an ordinary country boy who had spent his whole life farming. His physique couldn't possibly compare to the Pokémon-like muscle men in the army. In Will's eyes, this so-called recruitment by the Land Kingdom was just looking for cannon fodder to scout the enemy and act as shields. With Saki's style of doing things, this was a given. Ha, Ren sighed again. You need to be alive to enjoy wealth and power. I think you shouldn't risk your ambition for. Will started, shaking his head, trying to figure out how to persuade him. He felt Ren was a good person at heart and shouldn't have to sacrifice himself for the kingdom of the land. Fuchsia village was located in a place that the war wouldn't reach. There was no need to take such a risk. He could just wait quietly for the day peace arrived. But at that moment, Ren suddenly interrupted his gibberish. I have to fight for them. Ren's gaze rested quietly on the Growlithe and the others. I believe that humans and beasts can support each other and survive together. Will's mouth fell open. He stared blankly at the suddenly passionate young man before him. After a moment, he closed his mouth. This world was definitely not lacking in people who realized this. Liz in Johto, Ren in Kanto, there must be others in other regions. It was because of the existence of people like them that the era of leagues could come into being. It's just that, both Liz and Ren had appeared too early. It would be very difficult for them to change this era, where the negative impression of beasts was so deeply ingrained, within the limited span of a single human life. I've seen it. The passing land army slaughtered many innocent little ones. They hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, they would occasionally help the villagers by driving away pests. Sometimes I wonder if the reason our village hasn't been attacked by other beasts for so long is because of these little ones. I don't think the king of the land is right. Maybe it's because I'm not in a position to understand his thinking. But at least for now, I want to become a big shot. I want to change all of this. The words I say now, no one will listen, no one will understand. But if I become a big shot, then won't the people of the entire kingdom be able to hear my voice and accept my ideas? Ren passionately poured out the ambition that had been bottled up inside him for so long. Perhaps because he didn't get a response from Will, Ren felt a little awkward and sat back down, quietly gnawing on his corn. In his eyes, Will was just a big beast who wouldn't understand his thoughts. But Ren would never know that in Will's eyes, his words were like a clap of thunder. Will stared at him, a complex emotion swirling in his gaze, a lump forming in his throat. Of course he could understand everything Ren was saying, but that was because he had been influenced by the great thinkers of his past world. But Ren was different. He had never heard of anyone doing or saying such things before. This was an ideal that had awakened within himself. Do you know that this is a path to death? The awkward Ren heard Will's voice again and looked up at the behemoth beside him. He couldn't understand the words, but he seemed to sense their meaning. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of my death being worthless. Though thousands may oppose me, I will go on. The phrase inexplicably echoed in Will's mind. Good luck, Will said, not saying much more, but his heart was filled with a new vitality. His and Liz's path was not a lonely one. There were definitely many other people and Pokémon in this world, fighting with all their might for this common ideal. After that, Ren, seeming to realize that Will could understand him, began to speak endlessly about his vision and plans for the future. He said he wanted to establish an organization to protect all the beasts in the world. He said he wanted every person in the world to be able to meet a beast that they could connect with on a spiritual level. Time passed, and the sky began to darken. Will looked up and felt it was about time for him to leave. Are you leaving? Ren asked, seeing him stand up. Yes, Will nodded. All right. Thanks for listening to me so much today. By the way, you seem different from other beasts. Do you have a name? My name is Will. I don't understand, haha. But it's okay. My name is Ren Damaranki. Oh, right, wait a second, Ren said, scratching the back of his head. He suddenly remembered something and ran back into his hut. But Will was frozen in place, stunned by his name. Damaranki. In the future era of leagues, there was a very famous man named Mr. Damalanche. He was the president of the Pokémon League Executive Committee, who managed the Indigo League Torch, and often served as the person in charge of the Pokémon League conference. At the same time, he was also called the greatest man in the Pokémon League. Thinking about it now, it was possible that Ren was President Gudsho's ancestor. This is for you. When I used to wear this while farming, I always felt full of energy. Ren said, handing Will a red headband with a flame pattern on it. Thank you. Goodbye. Goodbye. Chapter 97, Sakaki's Three-Pronged Attack. On the way back, Will looked down at the red headband in his hand. Focus Band. It was a magical item. In the games, its effect was, the holding Pokémon has a 10% chance to survive a hit that would cause it to faint with 1 HP remaining. Whether it had the same effect in reality was hard to say. Even if it did, the probability certainly couldn't be a flat 10%. A level 1 Caterpie couldn't possibly survive a hit from a level 100 Rayquaza just because of this item. By the same token, between two Pokémon of similar levels, the chance of surviving a fatal blow was probably higher than just 10%. It all depended on the specific situation. Ultimately, it was an item of luck. Will figured this thing would probably be more effective on Liz than on himself. It would definitely be most effective on Red's Charizard or Ash's Pikachu, they had that effect even without the item. Will put the focus band away and used extreme speed, focusing on getting back to the Johto region. Fortunately, they hadn't left too late, so by the time he reached the palace, it was only around 7 or 8 in the evening. The dinner Hestia had prepared was still warm. Scorp and the others were all there for the meal, but Liz was conspicuously absent, which Will found strange. So, after a few quick bites, he ran to the study. Sure enough, Liz was there, frowning as she looked at several letters. What's wrong? Lan, welcome back. The situation on the front line is not good, Liz said, looking up at his voice and holding up a letter. Tell me. Will plopped down next to her desk, his hands on the tabletop as he looked at her. A few days ago, I sent several small teams to scout the MT Silver Road and see if there were any places to hide or set traps. But they unexpectedly ran into a team from the Kingdom of the Land there. Will frowned but wasn't too surprised. The MT Silver Road was the main thoroughfare connecting Johto and Kanto. Saki wasn't an idiot, what Liz could think of, he could too. So it wasn't strange for him to have stationed patrols there in advance. Otherwise, if the Dragonite Kingdom were to occupy the road, the land army would be trapped like turtles in a shell. The moment they emerged from the Viridian Forest, they would be beaten back by the waiting Dragonite army. If they didn't emerge, they would be gradually worn down by the wild Pokémon in the forest. So, controlling the MT Silver Road was essential for the Kingdom of the Land. Saki had probably sent people to station there a year or two ago. What's strange is, the Kingdom of the Land seems very eager to start a war with us. Hearing this, a question mark popped up in Will's head. With the sorry state the Land Kingdom was in, they dared to start a war? He wasn't sure about other things, but one thing was certain, because of his appearance, the current military strength of the Dragonite Kingdom was, without a doubt, higher than the Land Kingdom's. The Land Kingdom had just gone through 2 civil wars and was not in good shape, otherwise, Saki wouldn't have been in such a hurry to conscript soldiers. And their new training system hadn't been in place for long. Even if the results were significant, they couldn't compare to the Dragonite Kingdom, which had a 2-year head start. If Will were in Saki's position, he would absolutely be trying to stall for time. With the Viridian Forest at his doorstep, it would be quite difficult for the Dragonite Kingdom to invade. However, this also suits my plans. Since the Kingdom of the Land wants to start a war at this time, we must also seize this good opportunity. It's time to start preparing the battlefield, Liz said. I have a bad feeling about this. Saki is no fool. He must have a trump card up his sleeve to be acting so boldly. I'm going to go to the front lines and see for myself. Meanwhile, in the capital of the Kingdom of the Land, Saki the White's 4 top generals were gathered together for a rare meeting. 3 men and 1 woman, the same gender ratio as the future Team Rocket executives. Ares, the god of war. A middle-aged man over 2 meters tall, covered in muscles more exaggerated than a macho's. He was the strongest of the 4 generals, both in personal combat and Pokémon strength, and also the one Saki trusted the most. Hephaestus, the god of fire. A young man with red hair and shark-like teeth. He had been adopted by Saki as a child and was hot-tempered and skilled in battle, but not one for thinking. Hermes, the god of commerce. A man with spiky hair and glasses. He was not a warrior but was intelligent and skilled in business. He had earned more than half of Saki's wealth, and he was the one who had revised the army's system of rewards and punishments. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. A lithe woman in revealing attire with golden skin and eyes as sharp as an eagle's, carrying a giant bow 2 meters long on her back. She was a master of forest warfare, and most of the beasts in the kingdom had been captured by her and her team. Artemis, how is the mountain road coming along? Saki asked, sitting on his ornate throne with his legs crossed, looking down at the only female general. Boss, at most, it will take another week to clear it. Ares, take your team and help her. I want that road cleared in 3 days. Any later and that Dragonite Queen might realize something is wrong, Saki said, clearly dissatisfied. Yes. Ares nodded. Hermes, how are the preparations for the Air Force? Ready. We can depart at any time. Very good. That unit is the most critical part of this operation, Saki said, nodding. The boss's instincts are as sharp as ever. You correctly guessed that the Dragonite Queen would be eager to start a war. When the battle begins, our Air Force will circle around from the side and strike their capital directly. We'll use the Dragonite clan and the citizens of their kingdom as hostages. With the Queen's personality, she will surely panic and might even surrender, Hermes said, pushing up his glasses with a sinister smile. The thing he admired most about Saki was not his strength, but his ruthlessness. Throughout the thousands of years of tribal warfare, most chiefs would not harm the common people of the enemy tribe, only killing the core lineage. But Saki was different. He didn't care if they were commoners, the old, the weak, women, or children. As long as it could bring him victory, they were all tools to be used and slaughtered. If she surrenders, it's for the best. I'll only kill the members of the Dragonite clan. If she doesn't, then I'll slaughter those people in front of her. We'll see if she still has the heart to command a battle then, Saki said, a smirk on his face. He knew he wasn't a genius, he had only learned to read in his 20s. But he was not blind to the situation. No one knew the state of the Land Kingdom better than him. He knew that in a head-on battle, they were no match for the Dragonite Kingdom. Therefore, to win, he couldn't play by the rules. He had to use dirty tricks. In his plan, the success of the flying unit was the absolute key to victory. On the main front, 2 other units would engage the enemy, doing their best to bog down the Dragonite army and buy the flying unit enough time. To ensure their path was clear, Saki had ordered Artemis to start digging a road through MT Silver 2 years ago, even before the Second Civil War. It was a tunnel leading to the other side of the MT Silver Road. The mountain was teeming with Pokémon, and its mines were a complex labyrinth. For humans to intrude on their territory and dig a road, what happened next needs no explanation. In the past 2 years, the number of people who had died digging that road was in the thousands. But these sacrifices were worth it, Saki felt no heartache at all. They were just useless slaves. To let them shine for the kingdom before they died gave their lives some meaning. Saki was confident the Dragonite Kingdom would never guess that he would use human lives to carve a path through the perilous MT Silver. When the time came, 1 unit would advance through the Viridian Forest as bait. The second unit would use the secret tunnel to get behind the Dragonite army, blocking their retreat and reinforcements. The final unit, the Flying Corps, would circle around south of the entire mountain range, over the sea, and strike the Dragonite capital directly, capturing everyone. A 3-pronged attack. Let's see how they handle it, Saki grinned, then turned to the Beedrill beside him. Beedrill, I'll be counting on you. All his troops, all his people, could be sacrificed. But not his Beedrill. As long as he had it, even if he failed today, he was confident he could rise again. Without it, he might as well just offer up his neck. But this war absolutely required its power, so he would send it on the safest route, the sea route. Bzz, the Beedrill scraped its twin stingers together in response. Then let us wait and see who the future of this land will belong to, Saki said, rising from his throne to look down at his 4 generals. Mobilize the entire army. All-out war. We will decide this in a single battle. Yes, sir. X4. Chapter 98, Guardian Dragon of the Nation. One morning, Liz, who was in her study, suddenly received an urgent report from the front lines. The intelligence was delivered by Skarmory, the Pokémon of her cousin and one of her top generals, Drake of the Dragonite clan. Without a word, Liz took the report and began to read. Will stood by her side, quietly waiting for her to finish and tell him what it said. The kingdom of the land has mobilized their troops. Liz's brow furrowed as she read the letter. She immediately put it down and called for Hestia and the other maids to help her into her armor. Liz, of course, knew how to fight. Don't be fooled by the fact that she now sat in her study all day like a gentle wife. The first 18 years of her life had been spent living in the tribe, where everyone, even the women, had to learn to hunt and fight. As the former princess of the Dragonite tribe and the chieftain's youngest daughter, she had been training in martial arts since she was a child. Will had noticed something was off back when he was a Beedrill. For an ordinary 8-year-old girl, Liz's physique had been exceptionally strong. She had followed him through the wind and sun of the forest for days on end, surviving on wild berries, and had at most developed a slight cough. And later, after the death of Goldie, Liz had embarked on her own path to kingship. At a young age, she had led the Beedrill swarm onto the battlefield, conquering one tribe after another. For a full 10 years, she fought. It was only at the age of 18 that she took over the position of chieftain from her father and established the Dragonite kingdom, crowning herself queen. But at that time, the land of Johto had not been completely unified. Many remote tribes still banded together to resist her. She then personally led her troops in battle for another 2 or 3 years before finally achieving unification. Now, another 10 years had passed, and Liz's physical condition and martial skills had naturally declined. But ever since Saki the White had shown his ambition for Johto 2 years ago, Liz had been making time to train and get back in shape. Although the 30-year-old Liz was no longer the valiant warrior she was at 18, she was still more than capable of putting on her armor and commanding on the battlefield. For a monarch to personally go to the front lines was a strange thing in Will's eyes. But in the eyes of Liz and the entire Dragonite kingdom, it was not strange at all. What kind of tribal chief didn't personally lead their troops into battle? Whether you were strong or not was one thing. Whether you dared to go was another. The warriors of the tribe would not listen to a coward. Although the Dragonite kingdom was now called a kingdom, as the first human kingdom in Johto's history and one that was less than 10 years old, many aspects of it had not changed much from the old tribal period. This included the maids who were now helping Liz into her armor. They looked to be in their 20s or 30s and had clearly received some training. They might look slender, but they could lift a 10-kilogram piece of light armor with one hand as if it were a basket of vegetables. What's wrong? An army of 3,000 to 5,000 cavalry from the Land Kingdom has suddenly emerged from the forest on the other side of the empty Silver Road. They're already fighting with our soldiers stationed there. No matter what, I must go and see for myself immediately, Liz said. By the time she finished speaking, her armor was already on. It was a suit of silver light armor, covered in scars, a clear veteran of many battles. Liz moved her limbs, then walked to the side and took down the cape made from Will's shed skin. I'll take you there. Hearing this, Will immediately scooped Liz into his arms and flew out the window. Lan, I haven't gotten my spear. I am your spear. The distance from the capital to the MT Silver Road wasn't much farther than to MT Silver itself. Even holding the 100-plus-pound Liz, Will, using extreme speed, arrived high in the sky above the road in just 10 minutes. As for Liz, she was already curled up into a ball in his arms. When they were leaving, she had wondered why he hadn't let her ride on his back. Now she understood. At this speed, she would never have been able to hold on, she would have been thrown off in a second. Lan, you're so fast, I didn't know you were this fast, Liz shouted, lifting her head after she felt Will stop. The strong wind had probably made her ears ring, which was why she was speaking so loudly. Don't be silly. Look down there. The battle has already started, Will said, patting her rear and gesturing for her to look down. The scene below was very strange. Hey! Liz looked down, her eyes also filling with confusion. The battle below was a one-sided rout. To the west, the light cavalry, personally led by General Drake and numbering over 10,000 humans and Pokémon, were chasing a small force of Land Kingdom cavalry of no more than 2,000, who were fleeing towards the forest to the east. And although it was called a battle, the land army was mainly focused on retreating, only occasionally turning to fire a few arrows for show. Are they trying to lure our troops into the forest? Liz guessed. The kingdom of the land is far too familiar with the Viridian forest. Who knows what kind of traps are in there? They could easily lead our men into the territory of other Pokémon. If more than 10,000 of our men go in, I doubt even 5,000 will come out. We can't pursue. We have to cut them off, Will said. He saw at a glance what needed to be done. The Dragonite army absolutely could not fight the land army in the Viridian Forest. This was one of the reasons for arranging the sea-based force, to block their retreat. The MT Silver Road was a flat plain where no traps could be set. But in the forest, who knew what kind of dirty tricks they could be killed by? Thinking of this, Will no longer hesitated. He didn't even have time to put Liz down. He opened his mouth and spewed out rings of fire. Fire spin! Wads of flame fell to the earth, landing on the wild grass of the MT Silver Road and instantly forming a natural wall of fire. The horses of the land army were startled and stopped in their tracks. Some of the men in the rear were even thrown to the ground by their mounts' sudden movements. What's going on? A beast! In the sky! It's the Dragonite Queen and her milk-drinking dragon! The land army was startled by the sudden attack, showing signs of falling into disarray. Damn it! Charge through! The commander of the unit shouted. Seeing the pursuing Dragonite army, he wanted to force his way through the fire wall. A little burn would at most singe a few hairs. But the horses didn't understand this. They just stomped in place, refusing to move forward. In the sky. Lan, Liz's eyes lit up. She felt this was a good opportunity, but she didn't know what to have him do next. Leave it to me. Liz didn't know, but Will knew very well. He scanned the land army and immediately noticed there wasn't a single beast among them. Otherwise, they would have already started to extinguish the fire. Looks like they never planned to fight us in the first place. Whatever their purpose, now that they're here, they're not leaving, Will said, diving down with Liz and quickly landing on the other side of the fire wall. If there had been Pokémon in this army, he wouldn't have dared to land so carelessly. In the world of Pokémon, against other Pokémon, unless you were a ridiculously overpowered champion-level behemoth or a legendary, the idea of a one-man army was a pipe dream. At his LV-55, Will was invincible in a one-on-one duel within an army. But on a battlefield, 10 LV-40 Pokémon could tie him down for a good while. 100 LV-40 Pokémon could easily kill him. But right now, there were no Pokémon in the land army. So, Will had nothing to fear. He first quickly placed Liz a safe 10 meters behind him, then looked at the land army, which was still stuck in place. Hurricane! Will waved his hands and wings, and a great gale immediately rose. The wind swept up sparks and blew them towards the land army. Sharp blades of wind and the creeping flames were like a deadly scythe. The horses instantly lost their minds, stampeding in a frenzy. Countless soldiers were thrown from their mounts, some even trampled to death by their own horses. Even the horses that were brave enough not to panic had their riders blown from their backs by the fierce wind. It's Lord Lan! So strong! Speed up! Seize the opportunity! Finish them! The Dragonite army in the rear now saw the commotion up ahead. Looking up, they saw Will single-handedly blocking 2,000 men. Their morale soared, and they charged forward with abandon. Damn you! The soldiers of the land army scrambled up from the ground, gripped their spears, and charged through the flames towards Will. The forest was so close, how could they be willing to fall here? And the Dragonite Queen was right in front of them. If they had to die, taking her with them would be a glorious feat, recorded in the annals of history. At this thought, the eyes of many of the land warriors turned red. Humph, Will said, looking at the charging rabble with a disdainful smirk. He was not lacking in large-scale AoE skills. Surf! He stomped his foot, and a 10-meter-high wave erupted from the ground, crashing down on the front ranks. And that wasn't all. A combination of brine and icy wind froze the soldiers charging behind them into ice sculptures. The occasional lucky one who made it to him was easily hammered to death by his fire punch and thunder punch. Monster, this thing is a monster. Run! Get away from it! Run around the sides! Run as far as you can! Seeing their commander killed by a single wave, the remaining land soldiers lost all will to fight and tried to flee around him. But by now, the Dragonite army had caught up. Cavalry chasing down infantry, the result was a foregone conclusion. The land army was almost completely wiped out. Lan! That was amazing! After the battle, Liz, who had been a bystander, rushed up and gave Will a big hug, planting several kisses on his belly and leaving a few lipstick marks. The surrounding Dragonite warriors also gathered around, showering him with praise. Even their Pokémon looked at him with worshipful eyes. Humph! Of course, Will said, crossing his arms, lifting his head, and wagging his tail, feeling extremely pleased with himself. This attack seemed to be just the beginning. In the following days, the Kingdom of the Land sent several more armies to raid them. But they were basically just feints, showing their faces outside the forest and shouting provocations. The moment Will appeared, they would immediately retreat, leaving him disappointed every time. After a few days, Will's fame skyrocketed. The people of the Dragonite Kingdom affectionately called him, the Guardian Dragon of the Nation. Chapter 99, All-Out War begins. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the entire Dragonite Kingdom became electric. The Kingdom of the Land had made such a huge fuss mobilizing its army, only to get punched in the face 3 times by their own Lord Lan, and was now cowering like a turtle. News of this had spread throughout the kingdom. Well before this, Liz had already issued a declaration of war, so everyone knew they were going to fight. At that time, people had been a little worried. Worried, not afraid. Not a single citizen of the Dragonite Kingdom feared war. The people who had survived the tribal period had hearts of iron. Any tribe that hadn't been through 7 or 8 tribal wars didn't even have the face to speak. A national-level war was a first for the citizens of both kingdoms. In the eyes of most who weren't personally involved, it was just a larger-scale tribal war. At most, they worried about whether they could win. But now, they weren't worried at all. At least within the capital, a large chorus of voices had risen up, hoping Liz would lead the full army in a single charge to the Land Kingdom's capital, take out Saki the White, and claim more territory for their kingdom. But a war between 2 nations was obviously more complicated. How could they be so rash as to charge in with their entire army like in the old days? This was illustrated by a new problem that had caused a dispute between Liz and Will. In this second life, Will and Liz had never had a conflict, because neither of them was a simple, naive child, and both had relatively peaceful and gentle personalities, often compromising for the other. This was their first real argument. The issue was where Will should be deployed when the war began. Liz insisted that Will should lead the sea-based force. Because he was the one who had pioneered the sea route, he was the most familiar with it. With him leading, they could greatly reduce the sea unit's losses and speed up their arrival to support the main front. Besides, on the main front, the Dragonite army was already stronger than the land army. To put it bluntly, even if the land army had some scheme, as long as the Dragonite army didn't stupidly follow them into the forest, the land army couldn't do anything to them. They could easily hold their ground until the sea unit arrived. Therefore, the main front was not lacking Will's top-tier combat power. But Will believed he should stay by Liz's side to prevent any possible accidents. The Land Kingdom's probing attacks these past few days were a joke to many, but Will, who had personally participated, felt that something was wrong. The enemy was clearly trying to provoke them into declaring an all-out war. Saki was not an idiot, it was obvious he had a secret plan that he believed would lead him to victory. And this plan could only be used during the final, all-out war. Furthermore, there was a high probability that this plan was targeted directly at Liz. In that case, Will, of course, had to stay by her side to protect her. Moreover, the entire reason he had worked so hard for so long was to protect Liz. Helping her protect the kingdom was secondary. Her life came first. The sea route was already cleared, what danger could that unit possibly encounter? Could they coincidentally run into another Land Kingdom naval force? What if something happened to Liz on the main front while he was gone? If the leader was lost, the Dragonite Kingdom would fall all the same. Will didn't think the people would place their hope in a beast they couldn't even properly communicate with. And he didn't think that if Liz died, he would have any desire to protect her kingdom. At most, he would grab a few members of the Dragonite clan and run. This day, Liz was in the study, still trying to persuade him. Will just crossed his arms and turned his head, completely ignoring whatever she was saying, which was making her want to cry. If she wouldn't listen to reason, then there was no point in talking. When the time came, the wings were on his body. He would fly wherever he wanted. Bang! The study door was violently thrown open, and Hestia rushed in anxiously. Lady Liz! The land army has emerged from the forest. This time, the enemy force is massive, roughly estimated at 15,000. They are advancing towards us. It seems they intend to start the final, all-out war. Prepare my horse. The entire army moves out, Liz said, her brow furrowing slightly, but she was not panicked. Yes. Hestia nodded and left. Lan, there's no more time to argue. You must go lead the naval force. Go now. Humph. Will just glanced at her, looking completely unconcerned. He even plopped down on the floor, which almost made Liz die of anger. Looking at him, she knew he still intended to go with her to the main front. This was the first time Lan had ever been so disobedient. Lan, I'm begging you. Just this once. Whether the naval force can successfully flank them is related to the lives of thousands of soldiers. It could even affect the entire war. We absolutely cannot lose, she pleaded. Will sighed. In the end, he compromised. Liz was the commander of this war. She would be the one to bear the consequences of any wrong command. This time, their hearts were not linked as one. She didn't let him do as he pleased, and he chose to trust her judgment. Thank you for trusting me, Lan. I love you, Liz. Seeing him finally relent, broke into a smile. She bounced over and kissed his cheek. I'll be waiting for you on the main front. Even if there's an accident, if you don't come, I won't die. You'd better not, Will grumbled. He flew out the window and headed towards Jubilance Town at full speed. The naval force was already stationed there, ready to depart at any time. With his speed, he could reach it in just a few dozen minutes. I'll be waiting for you, Liz whispered, watching his distant figure. She then turned, went downstairs, and, with Hestia's help, donned her armor, mounted her horse, and led the army towards the empty Silver Road. Saki had a plan. Liz, of course, knew this. She knew it even better than Will. After all, she had watched with her own eyes as he had taken down the Sylph King and seized the throne. So, she was naturally wary of his bizarre actions these past few days and had her own countermeasures. She didn't know what his specific plan was, but the Dragonite kingdom was prepared with 3 hands. The first was the main frontal assault. If they could push all the way to the land capital, that would be best. But this was unlikely. As mentioned, the moment the land army retreated into the forest, their advance would slow, and their casualties would rise. They might still win, but at a high cost. The second hand was the naval encirclement. This was the most crucial part. Until the naval force arrived, they could not fully commit to chasing the enemy. They had to fight slowly, drawing it out, to give the naval force time to come up from the forest and block the road. The third hand was the measure to prevent Saki's secret plan. Liz had summoned the Beedrill swarm to the capital. Yes, the very swarm she had brought out of MT Silver all those years ago, the one that had been personally raised by Will in his first life. Their numbers were now at 500. The Beedrill Alpha, Wally, was a high-level LV-55, and his strongest lieutenants Millie, Frost, and Rusty were all around LV-45. The Beedrill swarm was not part of the Dragonite kingdom. They listened only to Liz's personal requests, and that was only because Wally and the others still saw her as clan. Once they passed away, the other Beedrill would likely no longer obey her. Normally, they occupied their own territory in the MT Silver range and did not interfere with the kingdom. Only when Liz was in a true crisis would Wally lead his swarm down the mountain to help. With 500 Beedrill and the 100 or so Pokémon from the academy guarding the capital, Liz felt that whatever trick Saki had, it would be useless against such a force. After all, her own top generals only had Pokémon at LV-50 or slightly higher. MT Silver Road. General Hephaestus. Speak, the young man with fiery red hair said, brandishing his spear, already eager for battle. Beneath him was a majestic Rapidash. The flames burning on its body gave off an intense heat, and no ordinary horse dared to come within 3 meters of it. The Dragonite army is on the move. Did the Dragonite Queen come? No, their advance force is led by General Drake. Humph. So she suspected something. It's all that useless Artemis's fault, taking 2 years and still not finishing that road, dragging this out for so long. Hephaestus's expression soured upon hearing Liz wasn't there. He had hoped to take her head himself and return for glory, perhaps the boss would have even made him a duke. The messenger beside him didn't dare to respond and just kept his head lowered in silence. Fine. Proceed according to the plan. Engage them a few times, then retreat into the forest. Yes, sir. Within MT Silver. When do we move out? Artemis asked the tall man beside her. Although she was reluctant, this man was stronger, his status was higher, and she had to obey his command. Not yet. We at least have to wait until the flying unit has departed. And the Dragonite Queen hasn't appeared yet. We'll wait until she shows up, Ares said, crouching calmly in the tunnel, in no hurry at all. On the other side of the MT Silver Road. Lady Liz, are you only sending General Drake's unit? To fight a whelp like Hephaestus, he is more than enough, Liz said, dressed in her silver armor and white cape, turning her head to look south. The towering MT Silver Range blocked all of the sea breeze, but she could feel that Lan was on the other side of that mountain, fighting with her. When do we advance? Wait. Slow them down. Let the naval force circle around. Liz retracted her gaze and looked toward the road ahead, where the faint sounds of battle were already drifting on the wind. The first fight had begun. Roared Char. Behind her, Charizard stood on the ground, growing impatient. He had never been in such a large-scale war and was eager to rush forward and spit fire on a few hundred people for his queen. Gliscor, Scorp reached out and patted Charizard, reminding him to be patient. He kept in mind the words Will had told him before he left, they must stay by Liz's side at all times and protect her. They could not, under any circumstances, rush into the enemy camp on a whim and leave her alone. Besides them, Iris had even sent her little Splasher and Natty to join them. Their levels were too low to make a difference on the main front, but they were more than qualified to stay by Liz's side and provide support. Natty, in particular, could fly into the sky and use her psychic powers and keen eyes to scout the area, ensuring no one could sneak up on the queen. MT Silver, middle ring. In the cave, the old Scyther felt the earth tremble. It walked outside, frowning as it looked towards the southern sky. It felt a sense of unease. Scyther. Another Scyther came out of the cave, saw its leader, and shrugged. Scyther. Scyther. The old alpha nodded firmly after hearing his words. 1 minute later, 10 Scyther flew out from the middle ring of MT Silver, heading straight to the south. Chapter 100, The Original Timeline. On the sea. Following behind Will were about 30 medium-sized sailing ships, each carrying approximately 100 soldiers. This number didn't include their Pokémon. Counting the Pokémon, the total force was 3,500. Because high-level Pokémon tended to be large and heavy, they were unsuitable for sea travel, so this naval support unit only included 500 Pokémon. While 3,500 might sound small, the combined total of both armies on the main front was less than 70,000, and only a quarter of that was comprised of Pokémon. The tribal period had only just ended, and the human population growth rate hadn't yet recovered. This war, despite involving 2 entire regions, was actually not that large in scale. This support force of 3,500 was already a very strong unit. To make the fleet move faster, Will had been using a weakened hurricane along the way to speed up their sails. The soldiers on the ships were all astonished by his power, marveling at the guardian dragon of the nation. To be able to accelerate 30 ships just by flapping his wings was a power they couldn't even have dreamed of. The journey proceeded smoothly. No dangers occurred. The potential threats along this route had already been eliminated by Will. Lord Lan. Look ahead. Just then, a scout on the watchtower of the ship below suddenly pointed forward and shouted. Will looked up, and his scalp went numb. The sky ahead was thick with Pokémon, a black mass of at least 700 or 800. The majority were Butterfree and Beedrill, but there was also no shortage of Pidgeotto, Fearow, Ledyba, and Venomoth. Bug types accounted for more than 90% of them. These were all Pokémon commonly seen in the Viridian Forest. In the future, the Viridian Forest would be world famous as a bug forest, and the sheer number of bug catchers there was proof of this. It was only natural that the Land Kingdom's army would also have many bug-type Pokémon. I see, Will murmured, looking at the massive flying army ahead. He finally understood why Saki had been so bold. This was his true trump card. Just as the Dragonite Kingdom hadn't expected the Land Kingdom to have a naval force, the Land Kingdom hadn't expected them to use the sea route either. Only, Liz didn't know that the Viridian Forest contained countless flying bug Pokémon, and Will had never imagined that Saki could assemble a Pokémon army that didn't even need human command. And Saki, on the other hand, could never have predicted that Will would not only become so powerful in 2 years but would also be an expert in naval combat, single-handedly carving out a relatively safe sea route. As a result, by a twist of fate, their 2 flanking forces had collided. As for what this air force intended to do, Will could roughly guess. Sending them to the main front would be useless. The military gap between the 2 kingdoms wasn't something 700 low to mid-level Pokémon could overcome. But against ordinary people, these Pokémon were death-dealing beasts. Their only possible target was the capital of the Dragonite Kingdom. Ruthless, Will's eyes turned cold, a trace of fury appearing in them. Thinking of Iris and Hestia, who were still waiting in the palace, his mood soured terribly. Knowing Liz's personality, if the capital was taken hostage, she would definitely try to negotiate. And for the stronger Dragonite kingdom to be blackmailed into negotiations, the consequences would be catastrophic. Bzzz. Before Will could even give the order to attack, the enemy began to press forward. All forces. Stop, Will said, raising a hand to stop the fleet commander just as he was about to give the order to engage. Lord Lan. Could it be that Lady Liz has other arrangements in the capital? The commander asked, his eyes lighting up as he whispered. Yes, Will nodded. But his reason for stopping the attack wasn't just because of the forces back home. It was because if a conflict broke out here, his own fleet would likely be annihilated. He was more worried about the main front. If Saki had some other plan targeting Liz, it would be bad. And, just as Liz had said, if the naval force didn't block the forest from behind, the Dragonite army would suffer thousands, or even tens of thousands, of deaths in the pursuit. Even if they won the main battle, Liz would not be able to conquer the kingdom of the land. Stopping this air force could be left to the Beedrill swarm back at the capital. The sea unit must get to the front lines. In any case, this air force might have to pass the Gliscor's isolated island on their way, and a conflict might break out there. If they were lucky, this air force might not even reach the capital. But all of this was conditional on that Pokémon being stopped here. Will's gaze shifted to the very back of the flying army. There was a Beedrill that was 7 meters long. This was far beyond a simple alpha level. The hegemon of Viridian Forest. It was the only conclusion Will could draw. Although the Viridian Forest was vast, its Pokémon density and competitiveness were no match for MT Silver. A LV60 Pokémon could probably rule the entire forest. This Beedrill was the reason Will had stopped the fleet from engaging. If it were just the Alpha Beedrill, Will would have led all their Pokémon to destroy it. But the problem was the 800 other flying Pokémon with it. On the sea, the humans' only attack was with arrows, and if the ships were sunk, it would be a disaster. If they fought, Will's side only had a few hundred Pokémon, half of whom couldn't even fly. If this Alpha Beedrill decided to fight them here, the naval unit would have few survivors, and Liz's flanking plan would be ruined. Liz, your decision was the right one, Will sighed, thinking back to their argument. In the entire Dragonite kingdom, perhaps only he could stop this Beedrill here. If he had stayed on the main front, the capital would have been doomed. Even Wally's swarm couldn't stop this monster. So, Liz's decision had, by a twist of fate, been the correct one. You continue forward. The plan is unchanged. I will hold him here, Will gestured, conveying his intentions to the fleet commander. But the commander hesitated, then gritted his teeth and ordered the fleet to proceed. He wasn't sure if the beasts in the sky would suddenly attack them. But Queen Liz had already given the order. In all things, Lord Lan's command was primary. Bzz, the Land Kingdom's air force grew restless seeing the fleet below, but Saki's Beedrill forcibly held them back. By coincidence, it had the same thought as Will. The air force could not be stopped here, they must attack the capital, or the Land Kingdom had no chance of victory. As for the main front, if they lost, they lost. Saki had never expected them to win anyway. So, Saki's Beedrill waved, ordering the air force to ignore the fleet and continue forward. A strange scene unfolded over the sea. Two enemy military forces simply passed each other as if the other didn't exist. Only Will and the Alpha Beedrill remained, staring each other down from a distance. Bzz. You are not getting through. Will shook his head, his eyes deep. The air force wasn't the problem, the Beedrill swarm at the capital could handle them. But this Alpha Beedrill had to stay here. It could not be allowed to go to the capital, nor could it be allowed to return to the main front. He worried that if the air force failed, it might go rogue and try to assassinate Liz on the battlefield. The chance of success was low, but not zero. Today, no matter what, Will had to drag this thing down with him here. The original timeline, the Kingdom of the Land must have won, right? Will thought, looking at the Beedrill, his mind flashing through everything that had happened since he arrived in this world. If the Dragonite Kingdom hadn't met him, they never would have discovered the battle for EXP tactic, nor could they have implemented the sea flanking strategy. And going back even further, if Liz hadn't met him in his first life, she might not have even survived the Sylph tribe, let alone gained the support of the Beedrill swarm. Without them, it was hard to say if she could have even united Johto and built her kingdom. In the original timeline, without him, the path was clear. The Dragonite Kingdom would have been crushed. The Gligar Island would have been purged, which is why in the games, it was a desolate, Empty island. Perhaps this Beedrill would have flown past that island and personally slaughtered all the Gligar. And because Johto was ruled by the brutal Land Kingdom, the region would be plunged into constant war, finally incurring the wrath of Ho-Oh and Lugia. But I'm here this time. History will not follow its original path. Will and the Beedrill faced off. They both knew they could not advance until they dealt with the one in front of them. They waited. 3 minutes later, after their respective forces had disappeared from view, both of them flapped their wings and vanished. Extreme speed. Focus energy. Wing attack. Will shot forward, appearing behind the Beedrill, his wing slamming forward. The flying type move would deal double damage. Swoosh. But in the blink of an eye, the Beedrill had already moved with agility, its speed hardly any slower than his own extreme speed. So fast. Will's eyes widened. He had no time to think. The Beedrill's attack was upon him. Pin missile. Countless small needles shot from its body, snaking through the air and attacking Will from all directions. Fire spin. Will gathered flames in his mouth and spun his body, releasing a giant tornado of fire that enveloped him, forming a 360-degree flame shield. He then dove straight down into the sea, blocking the needles and obscuring the Beedrill's vision. As a former Beedrill himself, how could he not know their weakness? Because of their wings, Beedrill cannot touch water. Once wet, their bodies become heavy and their speed plummets. Therefore, he had to make good use of the ocean below him, and rain dance. Dark clouds began to gather in the sky, and soon a light rain began to fall. The Beedrill, hovering in the air, vibrated its wings at high speed. It sensed Will's intent, but there was nothing it could do. It didn't have a move to change the weather. Under the cover of the sea, Will quickly stacked his buffs, 3 dragon dances and a focus energy. Surf. From beneath the waves, Will attacked. A 30-meter high wave rose from the sea, carrying him with it as it crashed toward the Beedrill like a hurricane.
Additionally, if you would like to request novels and access my Google Drive where I have 200+ audiobooks, then you can join my Patreon. Link is also provided in the description.